Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Bernd Kräftner. For those who are not part of the art science community, and there are quite a few, I'm part of the art science master course at the Angewandte. And before we go into this workshop and we will dive into this topic maybe in more detail, I would ask Anita to say a few words who you are, what Inflieger is, what you do. And first of all, thank you very much for hosting this workshop. And after this, then we will go into this workshop. Please.
My name is Inta Kaya, and my background is contemporary dance and choreography. And in 2000 I initiated a project called Inflieger, and it's a project from artists for artists and an initiative for dance and performance, and also we try to build up a network for independent performance artists and also transmedia art. And recently we are doing a project, called Stoffwechsel, Ecologies of Collaboration. And so now there are some of the artists involved and are also here tonight. And it's Sabina Holzer and also Lisa Hinterlein, former. Then we have Claudia Hoy, and also Kilian is involved, and Yasmin. So
I'm just looking at the English of indicating.
So I asked Sabina.
Yeah, it's a project which goes over 2 years, and it's also a transmedia project. Also, finally, I like working in the combination of theory and practice. And as Anita said, it's like mainly people from the art scene are engaged, and yeah, and in this sense, we have been very happy that Kilian invited Hornborg yesterday for the lecture. Host you today. And during the project, like each of us has a certain trajectory of research, which we have performative or settings during the years. And we had 1 year, and now we are starting the second phase, so to say. And it's about how we can work together, how we can live together, work together. Welcome.
Thank you again for having us here.
Thank you again for being here.
Yeah, we were. I mean, that's so nice. You said the word Stoffwechsel. You were talking. You understand the German word Stoffwechsel.
Stoffwechsel, yes.
Yeah.
Marx talked about Stoffwechsel.
So metabolism is a topic which is, I think it fit quite well. The background story of why we were ending up with this workshop has to do with the question of our annual topic during our academic year, that is connected on the one hand to a collaboration with CERN, the Large Hadron Collider, and on the other hand, so how they try to deconstruct nature in this big machine has something to do with machine, but in a different way. And we wanted to counterbalance this big ideas on matter and this big experiment on matter, counterbalance it with a more humble and mundane thing that is called the woods. So what is happening? What is a wood? What is kind of nowadays in different locations or in different worlds, let's say a wood. And for this behalf, we were inviting quite a few people to talk about the notion of woods coming from the natural science. You say you were from the Boku, you were involved in forestry. Sorry, I missed your first name.
Marcus.
Marcus is involved in this research, and it's super that I know this now, that you were also related to this topic. And in the end of this year, we intended, I know that you are a farmer, even though you are not so much involved now. Sweden has a lot of woods, and maybe your thoughts you have in mind, maybe in your background, that we are intending to make an excursion in the end of the year to Ukraine to spend there 10 days in the woods, in an environment that is not ordered in the way, socio-technical ordered in a way that we have it here in Middle Europe or in Scandinavia. And I think it would be also beneficial for us to have some thoughts for us from you. What can we do there? Because I think, and that I got when I was reading the articles of Alf, it is interesting for us coming from academia, being in an educational system, being exposed to theoretical insights and issues, then, of course, what to do with that. And Alf in his papers, as I understood it, is kind of calling to action also. So calling to action, so what do we do? And in a few papers, he's quite critical, for instance, about A&T and active network theory on two levels, I would say. On a theoretical level, where you were writing this paper on agency and consequences, but also on a polemical level. And we could say, no, does has polemics in the academia any room? But we are here open, so we don't have any dogmatic things where we say this is not allowed to be discussed here. We are not police, so we invited Alf also to challenge ourselves a bit in being maybe too mainstreamized by all our readings on Latour at whatever. And I have to look at myself, of course, into the mirror, and I have since 2009, 2005, I'm involved in transdisciplinary teaching at this university. And of course I'm using A&T not so much as a thing that you need to talk about and you need to show because it's cool, but because I experienced it in the 90s myself in encountering by chance this A&T concept, and I found them quite, I did not refer to them on a theoretical level more, but on a applied level, where I said, hey, that's a great thing to maybe use in an artistic and research context to talk about and analyze, I use the word, analyze scientific projects, scientific issues, not only scientific issues, all sorts of issues, and have a way to enter into not so easy situations when you, for instance, enter an issue or controversies where this expert-non-expert relationship plays an important role, where the question in whose name you are talking is an important question, and you all, or some of you probably know this, because going into a field comes along with these problems of your own role. Who are you, and what are your preconceptions, and why are you doing that, and how you do research. And that was more or less my way to encounter this, and Alf, I think, is representing, he said yesterday, he's an 80% Marxist. He's representing also the question of how relates A&T to a more leftist way to think about our world. And you know, maybe some of you, that Bruno Latour in some of his writings, or not some, many of his writings also challenges or refers to the notion of critique itself. So what is it doing? And I think, and I hope we can discuss this. I think I'm with you when we are also happy when you are, for those also who have been there yesterday and already had some thoughts about what's going on here. Also, please join us in our discussions and the question how we are talking about this call for action. And I'm stopping now. And I see that the big question is, you had some structuring via PowerPoint slides.
So I think what we very clearly agreed on yesterday is that I could have now a half an hour
break.
Half an hour
Make that
break.
half an hour break.
A presentation on AMT, relative humanism, and then we'll open up the discussion, and then with intermittent breaks here and there, we'll try to follow the discussion in a way, and then Alf can take the stance again and maybe fill in when we encounter open questions.
Because I guess yesterday the big question of students was, hey, it's called a workshop. Do we work? So Alf, that's a challenge for you. Let them work. Okay.
Thank you very much. One question, to shift the slides.
I asked if she can do.
Oh, you'll do that. Excellent. Thank you. The great thing about PowerPoint is when you lose your track and you don't know what you're going to say, you just ask somebody to press the button and you start talking. Thank you. I don't know. Many of you were at the talk yesterday, right? How many were not? I'm just interested in knowing how. Okay, because I was thinking how much I would have to reiterate my position, but maybe not. It's only 2 people, I think, who weren't there. And you weren't there?
No, I was there, but the audience.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. Okay, right. Yeah. Well, let me begin by saying that one of the most profound questions I got yesterday, and I love that discussion. I had really a lot of interesting questions, and I have them all inscribed in my mind. So they will influence me next time I talk. But one of the questions I got from this older gentleman, he's not here, is he? Who said, we knew this in the 70s. Why hasn't anything happened? And this is sort of a question that has animated me also. I mean, most of the ideas, even if I have new kinds of arguments, new kinds of evidence even, most of the ideas I got from my teachers in the early 70s. And among them were Andrea Frank, actually, who was mentioned yesterday, but my teachers in anthropology and Lund and so on, and the people I read. And I always thought of myself as being sort of Paleolithic. I keep holding on to the worldview from the 1970s. And I realize now I should be moving on, but why am I struggling against, after network theory, science and technology studies, and these post-humanist approaches? And I'm beginning to get a new understanding of this. I should mention also that I have written a review article recently on Donna Haraway and Anat Singh, who was mentioned yesterday, and a few other post-humanist writers. And I sent it to Kilian, and I realized the tone in that review article is not very nice, and I'm going to try to make it a bit more polite. So if I sound impolite today when I talk about these people, please accept it. I will change my tone, but it's kind of an old Marxist thing. But and then another issue, I mean, the reason I think what you are doing, it seems to me, is so important is that one of the answers to the question I received from this man yesterday, an answer that I did not give, but I think that is quite as important, is really to counter it with another question. Why is it so impossible to get these ideas across about machine fetishism, about rethinking the ontology of the machine? And I have been wondering, I think I said this to Kilian yesterday, I've been wondering whether the problem is really about communication, about using an analytical language, a rather conventional academic language to try to express my intuitions about technology, and it just seemed that people, they don't register this. I mean, you have to remember, I've been talking about this for 35 years, and okay, there are occasional people who say, yeah, you've got a point there, but usually it just dissipates. And then there were people who suggested I should read Bruno Latour about 20 years ago, and said that he's basically saying the same thing. And I have been trying to read Bruno Latour for 20 years. And I think his best book so far, or the book that has really impressed me, was We Have Never Been Modern, one of his first books in 1993. But the more I read of him in more recent times, I get extremely frustrated, to the point where I write angry reviews like this one. And what really worries me is that so many people are so influenced by him, and not only by Bruno Latour, but like-minded people. And I hope I'm not provoking you too much by this, but I have even more criticism towards Donna Haraway. And I was recently asked to write a review of Donna Haraway, Staying with the Trouble. Have you seen that book, Staying with the Trouble? There's something, you know, about the Stulucene. I can't even pronounce it. And the other book is The Mushroom at the End of the World by Anat Singh. And they are very close to each other, Haraway and Singh, and they are both into this post-humanist Latourian understanding of the world. Let me try to take a step back again and say that, at a very general sense, I think all of us, I don't think you would be in this workshop otherwise, have a strong inclination to be critical of the world we're living in right now, whether we call it capitalism or something else, modernity or whatever we want to call it. And our big challenge is how to articulate, how to express that criticism. And you must remember that I have been confined, I suppose you would say, within an academic environment. Okay, I have been given the freedom to be very interdisciplinary, which means I can shift from thermodynamics to history to anthropology, which is a privilege. But I'm still confined to a kind of a so-called rational discourse, a logic, argument, and I realize that there are many other ways, and probably better ways, of articulating critique than trying to express it within the confines of conventional academia. So if you want to think of me as a person who has been stuck in academia but really should have been somewhere else, you know, trying to express a criticism that I've had with me since I was a student in the early 70s, trying to express it in the language of academia, but open to other ways of expressing it. I mean, somebody mentioned yesterday this wonderful idea about depicting the machine as a the global machine. I just love that idea. I'd like to go home painting, you know. So I realized that analytical language is probably not the final way of expressing this kind of critique, and perhaps it's insufficient in the long run. It most definitely needs to be complemented by all kinds of other modes of expression. And here I'm sort of struggling with myself with this review I wrote of Donna Haraway, because she's into this, you know, and she gives some examples in that book of how you can express your disgust with global capitalism. And one of the pieces I remember is because it made me so frustrated, is she talks about, you know what crochet is? Crochet, you're English, right?
Yes.
How would you, do you know how to translate that?
I'd say lace work.
Lace work, yes, yeah.
So when you have a little
beads.
little nettles in it.
Yeah.
Needles, sorry, and you knit something, but you're knitting lace. Do you know this word, lace? It's
like a yarn, isn't it? You use a yarn?
Spitze.
Yeah, yeah. So, and she had a photograph of this collaborative crochet artwork depicting a coral reef. Now, the artwork was supposed to express horror at the fact that coral reefs are dying globally. One of the most beautiful things we can actually see, coral reefs. But I realized I adopted a very sarcastic tone. We can't save the world with crochet artwork, you know that kind of attitude. And I feel a bit hesitant about that now. But the Marxist in me, the 80% Marxist in me, says we're not going to do revolution with crochet, you know. And I could even throw at them things like, oh, it's a very bourgeois, neoliberal way of responding to what capitalism is doing to, you know, start making crochet artwork. But then I wonder whether what I'm saying is making more of a dent on world capitalism than crochet artwork. So I'm quite open to this kind of criticism. But let me start from the beginning and say the problems in that article that Bernd mentioned. It's called Artifacts Have Consequences, Not Agency. And as you can understand, it's an explicit confrontation with actor network theory, because if there's one thing we all know about actor network theory, it's the idea that artifacts have agency, right? Things have agency, and I have never been able to accept that. For me, the subject-object distinction is very important. It's very important to distinguish between not yet humans, I see you have a dog with you there, but also dogs and all living things. In fact, in that article, I suggest that all living things, all living entities are subjects. And that includes dogs, humans, but also trees and amoebas. I mean, I've been working, as you say, in forestry, and I certainly know that trees have agency. I don't know if you've thought about this, but trees, they extend their branches into the places where there's sunlight. They extend their roots where there's water. They have purposes. They want water, they want sunlight, and they respond to it. So they are subjects in that sense. They have agency. They register information from their environment. They use that information to respond to it. Even amoebas, these microorganisms, act in the sense that they purposefully absorb nutrients from their environment. And of course, humans are very complex, purposeful organisms. But for me, and I said this to Bruno Latour once when we were having breakfast in Rio de Janeiro, I think, I said, for me, the difference is not between humans and non-humans. The difference is between living and non-living. And for that is something that I want to hold on to. I think there's a crucial difference between a mouse and a rock, or a dog and a rock. And as a student, I remember reading Gregory Bateson, he was a really profound thinker, but he was also so much clearer than Bruno Latour, actually, because I remember one of his very, very clear examples he gives. He says, if you kick a rock, you can theoretically calculate where it's going to land. If you know the friction, the force of your kick, all the physical laws, you know that the rock is going to land right there. You could, in theory, predict it. But you can never predict where a dog will land if you kick a dog, if it's alive. Because a dog has a choice. It has a choice of whether to run that way, or bite and fight you, or, you know, a dog is a living organism, and the difference between the dog and the rock is that the dog can act. It has a purpose, it has a choice, it has agency. A rock does not have a purpose. It does not have agency. It can affect us, yes, in various ways. If you get one in your head, for example, it certainly will affect you. But it doesn't have an inner purpose.
May I just ask, because you were talking about the environment, but you also mentioned Uexküll in this respect in your article. I mentioned that Uexküll is talking about a more active promotion of environment and talking that also living organisms are producing environments, and the close relationship with this kind of natural environment.
You're right. We should get into that because the environment. The environment is such a problematic word because a lot of us think about environment and nature as similar. And I would argue that nature contains both subjects and objects. I mean, nature certainly includes rocks and mountains and other geological formations, but nature is also full of subjects, of sentient beings, trees and so on. Since you're going into the forest, I should mention the book I recently read by Eduardo Kohn, K-O-H-N.
Yeah, we have it on our...
How Forests Think. Yes. Because actually, believe it or not, because he doesn't refer to me, but he builds on me. He wrote that to me in an email that he read an article I wrote in 2001 called Vital Signs, which in itself builds on Jakob von Uexküll, the Estonian eco-semiotician, who argued that all species live in their own Umwelten, their own subjective worlds, so that a butterfly, a tick, a cow, even a flower has its own subjective world. And my conclusion from that is that an ecosystem is a myriad subjective worlds interacting. It's not just flows of matter and energy. It's not just what we can measure with natural science. It's about subjectivities, a billion subjectivities. To take one example, there's an eagle in Amazonia, the monkey-eating harpy eagle, and it keeps hovering over the rainforest like this, and it has very sharp eyes. And if it can detect the slightest movement in the rainforest canopy, it will dive for it because it somehow is registered to know that there's a monkey there. So that's how it gets its monkeys. But I mean, its entire perceptive apparatus is geared to the movement of monkeys in the rainforest. And the monkeys, of course, are geared to the movement of eagles, so they run off, you know. But this is just one example out of a billion possible of how species co-evolve, not just in terms of their physical constitution, but in terms of their perception, in terms of their subjectivity. So it really is a different way of understanding a forest, an ecosystem, as a system of subjective selves. This is Eduardo Kohn's point. Now, this is a far cry from going out into the forest and starting to talk with the trees, because that would be anthropomorphism. That would be to believe that the trees communicate in the same way that we do, and we don't, of course.
Is there a difference between
sorry?
Is there a difference between anthropomorphic and animist?
That's a good, very good question, and some people will argue there is no difference. You know the book by Philippe Descola, Beyond Nature and Culture? Marshall Salins, who is an anthropologist, wrote a foreword to that book. And he praises this. He says it's a paradigmatic shift. It's fantastic. And it is. It's a wonderful book. But in that book, Descola argues that there are four basic ways of understanding the world. There's our naturalism, there's animism, and then he talks about analogism and totemism. And he has this very nice structuralist kind of understanding of how these four different things are generated from the interaction of interiorities and physicalities. It's a very complex argument. But anyway, Marshall Salins, although he praised the book in his foreword, in an article a year later, he said that, well, the more I think about it, the more I realize that all these other kinds of ontologies, animism, analogism, and totemism, are really just forms of anthropomorphism. So your question is very relevant. Anthropomorphism, of course, as you know, is the projection of humanity onto non-human entities, whether living or non-living. And this is something that Descola studied in Amazonia very closely, how the Achuar Indians of Ecuador and thought about their the other animals and even the other plants in terms that relate to their own society. They projected their own social relations onto the relations with nature. So living in a society where you give gifts to everybody instead of paying for services made these Achuar Indians think of their relations to trees and animals in terms of gift giving. So they gave gifts to nature in the expectation that nature would give gifts back to them. So Descolat's argument there is that animism is really a projection of your own society onto nature.
But maybe it's also the other way around. Maybe they experienced nature as a gift.
Yes, absolutely.
And then they started
as a reciprocal relation,
yes.
Absolutely. And you know this old phenomenon you see among hunting peoples, that they often in the past used to believe that animals willfully gave themselves to the hunter. They allowed themselves to be killed. And this was because of a special kind of reciprocal exchange relation between the hunter and the game, or the master of the animals. So that the people would sacrifice things to the animals, and it would be viewed as a gift to them, so that the animals would reciprocate by giving themselves to the hunter.
And the interesting thing which you touch upon there is, this is the anthropomorphic, but what about the opposite in a way, the way that nature influences people? Is there evidence of this when you look at some of these traditional societies, where their existence is mediated by the way nature impinges on them? It makes them behave a certain way, rather than an interpretation coming from humans and nature. For example, the storm.
That's what I meant, yeah.
You mean like if indigenous people would think of nature as being a source of influence?
No, I'm thinking of the spiral dynamics when they start off with the earlier memes. They start off, I think it's the red meme, and they live in fear of the world, that a storm's going to destroy people, or this is going to happen to them. Nature is done to them by the gods. This is often how it's referred. Gods or outside forces make their society act in a certain way, rather than them interpreting and then, for example, giving.
Yeah. But I would argue that with that kind of ontology, you don't have the concept of nature.
No, but we do from our civilization.
Because we are naturalists.
But if we looked at this savages, if you like, then can we see an evidence there of them being more part of nature?
Yeah, but
living a more natural human existence than we are.
They would think of what we call nature in other terms. So, for example, a very common understanding among indigenous peoples is that your behavior is influenced by the ancestors. Now, what they call the ancestors might be what we call nature. For example, the Nayaka people of northern India, who have been studied by Nurit Bird David from Israel, the anthropologist, they have a saying that the trees are our ancestors. Now, if you're an anthropologist, you can go and say, oh, the trees are our ancestors. Okay, they think that the trees are their ancestors. It becomes a very literal understanding of what is a metaphor. And the important thing is to understand statements like that as metaphors. The trees are not literally understood to be our father's father's father or our mother's mother's mother, but what they're saying is our relation to the trees are similar to our relationship to our ancestors. We venerate them, we love them, we take care of them, we would never cut them down, you know. It's not to say that they are our relatives in the literal sense, but we have a relationship to them. So, and this is a big problem I have with many of the modern anthropologists, like Marisol de la Cadena, for example, who goes off to Peru and reports that the Runacuna, the Quechua living outside Cusco, think that the mountains are alive. I don't think they really think so. She thinks that they think so. But what they're saying is, you know, I have a relationship to this mountain. It's my master, it's my lord. But they're not saying, you know, oh, let's see what the mountain thinks. Not literally. And this is where anthropologists, I think, misinterpret the ethnography a lot of the time. So this is, I wrote this in another review. I'm not quite as nasty as in the Sing review, but I think this is a problem. Yes?
Maybe this is a point where I wanted to refer to a paragraph in the Latour's article on fetish and factish.
Yes.
He exactly is talking about what makes us believe in fetishes.
Fetish, yes.
Fetish, yeah, and there he is exactly making this point that the power of the fetish is more or less in the eye of the beholder, or the Western beholder, and the critic. Yeah. And
Okay.
he uses exactly the same phrasing and argument as you do. Yeah, so do you think that people who use a fetish are believing in a non-constructed autonomous fetish, but it's a way of relationship that allows a social order? That is his way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yeah? And so the deconstructing of a fetish for a critical mind is a way of misinterpreting exactly this.
Yeah. Okay, this is a very important issue in relation to Bruno Latour. Sorry, I don't know what the next image is, but could you check? Okay, fetishes. I had this. All right, here we go. All right. Yeah. Well, in the book that you mentioned, Bruno Latour published a book in 2010 called "On the Modern Cult of the Factish Gods." Now, he has a lot of neologisms, as you know. Bruno Latour invented the word factish to allude to the word fetish. Now, maybe I should give you a brief background about the word fetish. Marx made it very famous as a concept of political economy, but before then, it had been a concept in the history of religion. As you know, Freud used it in psychoanalysis, so it's a concept that has had a very wide applicability. It began with Portuguese sailors in the 16th century who went to the west, they sailed down the west coast of Africa and went ashore, and they found people in the villages there worshipping idols of wood or stone. And the Portuguese were, looking at, this is strange. And they called it feitiço. It's a Portuguese word, and it basically means magic, sorcery. So they came home to Europe and said, those people in West Africa, they are fetishists. They believe in feitiço, in magic. Then, of course, what they didn't think about was that every Sunday when they went to church, they were also fetishists because of Catholic relics and crucifixes and wine and bread and, of course fetishism is, but they thought fetishism is something very primitive. It's what they do in Africa, not in Europe. But what Karl Marx said, which was so anthropological, was, well, aren't we all fetishists? Aren't we fetishists in Europe? Look at the bankers, look at the economists. They think that money grows on their bank accounts like fruit grows on fruit trees, magically, on their own. So that was when he brought fetishism into political economy, thinking that the economists are fetishists, and he coined the notion of money fetishism. I think it's wonderful, and it really is a point of departure from most everything that I've done. Of course, I talk about machine fetishism, and I wish Marx would have done that too, because I think the same thing applies to machines, that we think of them as somehow alive, but they're just things. And what makes them alive is social relations of exchange, as I talked about yesterday. But we think of them as being alive, which is just as much fetishism as looking at money on bank accounts or stone idols in West Africa. But what does Bruno Latour, how does he relate to this? This is the problem I have. Because there's a big difference, very big difference between Latour and Marx. And the difference is that Marx wants to expose fetishism. He wants to reveal it and say, look, this is a misconception. It's misguided to think that objects are alive, that they have purposes, that, Whereas Latour says, So what? Everything is alive. Objects are alive. Agency, everything has agency. And he denounces Marxism for arguing against money fetishism. Now, for me, that is not a valid way of approaching the problem, for example, of the Anthropocene. And I've been trying desperately to find some aspect in Bruno Latour's argument and in the argument of actor network theory that could actually pose as a challenge, a critique of neoliberal capitalism.
May I join in briefly, just because I had to reread because I was reading this article, therefore I had tried to fetishism, and for what he's saying, he's saying that not really referring in this paper, which is in Pandora's box, called, I think, fetishes and blah. What he's saying there is that the iconoclast, the critic, is bringing himself or herself into a relationship to those who he or she accuses of being taken in by a fetish. And this is more or less the major point, he says, there, as I got it. This accusation and splitting a world between the other, who are taken in by a fetish, and those who know.
I know.
And this is a very interesting thing,
yeah.
Also concerning your own, for me at least, how I interpret, how your own role in academia. You were talking about communication and the problem of communication, being an expert on this, and wondering, why don't people accept what I think? And I think this is very much related to a problem that he addresses there, to this kind of transcendence of something and staying immanent, of putting the others as others, because this is he writing in his 93 book, We've Never Been Modern. Modernity makes us able to talk of the others, because the front
without the hierarchy.
With the front of modernization is making kind of a movement along this history and splitting between them and us, and make it better, more improves this split, because it will decrease the amount of people who still believe something and those who know.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I think this is very. So he's not so much, I would say, criticizing Marxism, because it's also kind of the very setup of his way to talk about fabricated entities. And I think the fabrication of entities is a decisive cornerstone in his way to look at the world, because the fabrication does not end, and this affects a department that is called human ecology, where you are the boss, because the word human, and this is a very decisive moment, the word human for Latour, I think, is also a fabricated thing that is not static, which is then a very interesting question for you, how you frame this humanness, because he said humanness is very much entangled with technology. And our human mind that we hold so dear, because it's that we are the king of the.
Right. Very good. Yeah. Well, I think exactly. I think this is a really central issue, the question of hierarchy. Now, Latour sounds very democratic, because he's saying, the parliament of all things, and let's not call anybody a fetishist. Who are we to talk about fetishism, We're just as much fetishists as they are. And it sounds very nice and democratic, and it sounds like he is attacking power and colonialism and hierarchy. But it may be the other way around. And to illustrate that, I would like to get back to this review that I wrote of Marisol de la Cadena's book. Her book is called Earth Beings, by the way. It's about a mountain near Cusco, which is sort of worshipped by local people, the Runa Kuna. Now, she is an anthropologist from Lima. She is a middle-class urban intellectual. She goes out to work with the Runakuna, who don't read, who don't write, who live from Lama pastoralism. And she says, basically, she's trying to argue in the book that, you know, they may be right that the mountain is alive. Who am I to say that it's not alive? And what I see her struggling with is the transition from colonialism to neoliberalism. Because we have been changing our idea about the truth. For the colonialists, it's very obvious, you can show that in Peru very clearly, how it's important to kill off the pre-Christian religion and pre-Christian beliefs, and to have one Catholic church covering the entire ontology of the Andes, you know. And now you have neoliberalism, and it's subtly different, because you have American tourists going to Cusco, paying thousands of dollars to find Andean shamanism. You see what I mean? And now, what is the difference between that and colonialism in a way? Cultural difference it's no longer something you have to suppress, you have to homogenize, you have to have a colonial power structure. Cultural difference is a quaint, funny way of, you know, perhaps we're even intrigued as middle-class Europeans. Wow, they're really deep. Like these people in India that you mentioned, you know, they have a different way of understanding the world. Okay, it's worth the air ticket down to India or to Peru to study Andean shamanism. We are consuming culture. We're consuming multiculturalism. So what looks like a very democratic process, multiculturalism, is really just a way of subsuming cultural differences within the market and making it into a commodity. Culture becomes a commodity, even shamanism. Now, I'm sorry, but I do believe that the final bottom line of Bruno Latour's message is the same. Let 1,000 fetishists bloom. We're all fetishists. And who are we to take a top position, you know? But unfortunately, the economists and the engineers don't read Bruno Latour. Bruno Latour is keeping the rest of us, the human sciences, the social scientists, the humanities, caught up in all these fascinating philosophical deliberations about ontology and agency and so on, but it doesn't change a thing about global capitalism. That would be my response. Okay, should we go on? Not just quite. I have to explain this. What I want to say is, I am very much of a materialist. I know, and I've been living as a farmer, spare time for 30 years. I know that things around us, both living and non-living, influence us very much. And I try to work out analytically in that article how these non-living things have consequences for us. They can constrain us, they can prompt us to respond, we can delegate functions to them, as in technology, we can attribute agency to them, as the Runakuna did with that mountain. They say that the mountain is alive. Of course, that affects human agency, but it doesn't affect the agency of the mountain. I have to tell you one little anecdote. In that book that Marisol de la Cadena wrote on the Earth beings, there is a person called Nazario, and he's tragically killed in a bus accident. You know, this often happens in the Andes, that a bus goes over a cliff, and there are a lot of local voices that. He's been making money on selling Andean shamanism to tourists. Okay, he learned from his father how to make despachos, sacrifices to Ausangate, a big mountain near Cusco. And for his father, this was a way of calibrating yourself, your subject, of relating to the mountain. It was a deep, animistic relationship between the mountain and his father. For Nazario, for his son, he realized he could make money on it. Now, I don't want to denigrate him, because he is He was just as good a person as anybody else. But with neoliberalism, those despachos to Ausangate became something very different from what they had been to his father. You could sell them to American tourists. And yes, he is killed. He's killed in this bus accident. And Marisol de la Cadena, an anthropologist from Lima, writes, there were local voices saying that the reason he was killed, the reason the bus went over the cliff, was the agency of the mountain, Ausangate. Ausangate was angry with him. Now, the big thing for me is, what does Marisol de la Cadena think? Does she agree that it might have been the mountain? So she says, well, you know, we can't deny that that's a possibility, but I don't think so, because Nazario was a good guy and so on and so on. But what is she actually saying? Between the lines you can read that she says, in principle, it's possible that Ausangate, a geological formation, could decide that Nazario Turpo should drive off the road or go off the road with the bus. And that for me is the limit of what is acceptable for me as a thinker, as an academic, whatever, as an intellectual. I just don't, we cannot just abandon all rationality. Because what then is the, why, if we, at some other point in the book, she deplores the fact that Ausangate is no longer attributed agency in the negotiations about the mountain, because the question is, should we save the mountain from becoming a mining project? This is a big struggle she's following. And she says, the important thing is to recognize that Ausangate has this earth being, Tirakuna, inside itself and whatever. The question is for me, if she deplores the abandonment of Andean religion, what is the difference compared to deploring secularization in general? Why don't we go back just to thinking that it's all God's will? You know, what's the difference between, you know, revering a mountain and revering Christ or the church or anything? What's the whole point of secularization? If we now find that this animistic understanding of the world, this animistic ontology, is something we need. Now, maybe many of you are deeply religious, and I respect that, and there have been periods in my life when I felt that that is also the option, but I still need to somehow make a divide between the analytical activity of understanding human role in the world and climate change and the Anthropocene and how we personally relate to the world. If Nazario's father needed those despachos to Ausangate in order to calibrate himself, perhaps we also need some way of calibrating with the world, fine. But it's not going to help us solve climate change. If somebody tells me what I would like to do to solve climate change, I'm not going to say I'm going to get down on my knees and pray, because it won't stop climate change as long as capitalism continues the way it does now. So I think we need to distinguish these two aspects. We have a subjective dimension, and we really need to take care of that. But there's an objective reality we need to understand too.
Just a brief remark concerning, because you are mentioning reason and ratio in your article and the question of the role of this. I think at least I have to be a bit of spokesperson for Bruno Latour here. This is my role here.
Yeah.
I never read in this book that reason doesn't play an important role, because he, I think, expresses very clearly the truth in the institution of science. This is, I think, written in his book, last book, Modes of Existence. It's everywhere, and not he, but also Isabel Stengers. They are very much in discriminating the role of reason in our world and what does it do in the name of reason. You know the distinction they do draw between capital science, science with capital S, and science with small s, and how this is, how they distinguish. And I would never think or deduce or derive from their thinking that they throw away critical and rational thinking in terms of our experimental attitude to matter, to questions of soft sciences or whatever. I never saw this in their writings. Even though when I remember that he was, Bruno Latour was at the École des Mines, of course, being exposed to engineers and teaching sociology there.
Can I maybe add something we already discussed privately, that the danger of reclaiming this rationality is that our common mode of rationality as it was formed and is now still used in the academics, and the emergence of this can be traced proportionally to the rise of industrial capitalism.
Yeah.
So with Kant, we have the first person saying we have to do science out of metaphysics. So this is where science and philosophical thought comes together, and this is like the trajectory which is starting at the exact same time as the steam engine starting its work in the UK. So I think and we just discussed this in private as well. The question is, what kind of rationality could it be, and how can we make sure that this reason we're looking for is not again overcoded by what is actually part of the system?
Yeah. Right. This is very, very important because I know when I mention reason or rationality, a lot of people react defensively and think, "Oh, he wants to defend the system." You know, I mean, there's as if there is something dangerous and even hierarchical about rational thought in itself. And I know I'm using the word rational here without really explaining it. Those of you who were at my lecture yesterday know that I'm extremely critical of the kinds of rationality we see in engineering or in economics, right? And these are sort of the standard kinds of rationality that I have enormous problems with, and I've spent like 30 years trying to deconstruct those kinds of rationality. But it's very important to say that in deconstructing them, I have been using rationality. Because I do think that the most powerful way of showing that the economists are wrong and the engineers are wrong is to use their own methodology of thinking, to use their own logic. And I don't think it's just their logic. I think rationality, I think there is something called logic, you know. I do think that there are logical deductions and not logical deductions. So in a sense, I do believe that economists and engineers, although they operate within their universes, within their bubbles, within their silos, the cognitive operation is not faulty. I believe in the systems of checks and rules with which they regulate their thinking. But then I believe that they live in bubbles. That's another thing. Now, if they left those bubbles and we applied the same kind of thinking, the same kind of logic, and make it sort of interdisciplinary, it would show that they're both wrong. But all using rationality. Yeah.
I think there's a simple illustration of this. In Britain, they used to have home economics that people went to the school. The idea of home economics was how to run the home successfully. And in casual terms, it was called cooking. Didn't just include cookery originally, it was all sorts of other aspects to it. It really was economics. And then they changed it. The whole move from the Conservative government was to have technology into everything. So it was replaced with food technology. And they gave marks for producing food with food technology. We look at the nutritional content, we look at other things. But the marks that came for producing the food contain no marks for taste. Now, when I eat food, I think the taste is quite important. It might be nutritional, but I want it to taste good. And I think this is the element that we see with the engineering approach, is that often emotion is just cut out of it. The kind of what I call design science aspect is cut away. The design aspect is forgotten. This is where interdisciplinary programs or cross-disciplinary programs can actually bring in someone from an artistic background who goes, well, why haven't you thought about this? You highlighted it yourself with your own presentation. You were, what's the word? You were self-deprecating. I'm not an artist, look at my presentation. But you did recognise that if you had been more artistic with your presentation, it would have reached people in a different way, that perhaps that would have communicated, that would have crossed that gap of understanding, where people took a discourse where they wanted to be argumentative to the points you had, instead of grokking it, kind of taking in that understanding that you presented. And I think this is what the problem I see with science, reductionist science, is it's cut away the emotion, it's cut away the feeling, and those aspects, and people have ended up producing something that's just technology, and their science is focused on producing a technology which ignores the humanity.
But see, I'm hesitant because I don't think the main problem really is cutting away the feelings.
Ignoring them.
I don't think, for example, that I'll agree that the reason why I worked on this stuff for 30 years is because I have very strong feelings about this. I'm really, really angry at the way the world is being destroyed, you know. I mean, I love rhinoceroses, for example, rhinos. And I know that they're going to be extinct, you know, in a few years' time. And I have grandchildren, I have 3 grandchildren, and I know that they may be alive, you know, 80 years from now, and what's the planet going to look like? So, believe me, even if I can smile and hold a rational argument, I have a lot of strong feelings about what's going on. But I still think that our way of sort of confronting the problems facing the planet have to be dealt with not only emotionally, of course emotionally too.
That's what I'm saying, it has to have the emotion in there too.
It has to have an analytical, yes. And I would argue that the engineers, they don't only sort of shut away the emotions, that's not the big problem. The big problem for me, as I argued yesterday, is they shut away society, world society, inequality. They shut away ecology. I mean, they exclude a lot of things that are not just about emotions, but are about taking other sciences, other disciplines, in fact, other aspects of reality into account. So emotion is very important, but I don't think we should get too mixed up. We shouldn't mix up emotions too much with the intellectual activity of understanding the political problem. Because otherwise I could, you know, I just sit here and just be angry or sad, and it won't help anybody.
You wouldn't just be angry, you wouldn't just have emotion, you'd have emotional rationality to put it together.
Well, maybe it's enough
together, it'd be a combination.
What I tell my students is, it's very important to be driven by emotions, to have your research questions formulated because of the emotions you have about the world. But that is not the same thing as using emotions to answer those questions. We still have an analytical method that we can use to answer questions, even if the questions are motivated by emotions.
Why isn't an emotional answer satisfactory? Why isn't it okay to have an emotional answer?
Because
engineers
and economists will completely ignore you.
But you've just said that's the problem, that they do ignore you.
They do, but I still have a hope of proving my point, or that somebody will, you know, 50 years from now. Okay, I'm sorry for usurping, so I know this is a workshop, and I'll shut up very soon. I just want to finish off. As you see, what I'm arguing here is that objects do not have purposes. Could you take the next image, please? And this is very important to me, because Latour uses the word subject-object in a different way than I would. For him, subject-object is a hierarchical relation where a subject oppresses an object. It's a political relation, a repressive relation, right? For me, subject and object is about whether you have a sentience, if you have a subjective, inner subjectivity or not. That's why I said there's a difference between a dog and a rock. A dog is a subject, a rock is an object. Now, to say in an ontological sense that there's a difference between having an inner sentience or not is not the same thing as treating somebody as if they were just an object. We shouldn't confuse the ontological distinction between subjects and objects with the colonial act of oppressing colonies or women or animals or other ethnic groups. It's not the same thing. But this is the conflation that the posthumanists are making. As soon as you make a distinction between subjects and objects, then you are stating a hierarchical political relationship about the right of some people to oppress other people or animals or nature or something else. And I think those are two different issues. I would say rationality is not equivalent to colonialism. And this is my big argument with the post-humanists. For them, for Haraway, for Tsing, for Latour, it seems like rational thought is colonialism. And I'm saying it's not the same thing. We can be rational without being oppressive politically. I want to give analytical reason a chance to be assessed for its own right. It can be emancipatory. And I would in fact argue that Karl Marx was certainly very rational, very analytical, but he was not a colonialist. If you're going to tell me that Marx was a phenomenon of colonialism, then I'll be ready to take that discussion. But he was about as critical as you can be to the system. But he would never have abandoned rationality.
Maybe I could park in there because I think I would make that claim.
Marx was a colonialist?
No, he's a product of colonialism.
Okay, all right.
Because, I mean, he reacts to a situation which is only produced by colonialism.
That's true. Don't we all?
Don't we all?
Don't we all?
And don't we all, yes. And I was reminded by Juan's intervention yesterday about free thought and where are you allowed to say this and where are you not allowed to say this. And I was thinking you had this graphics with the GDP, the global distribution, and the distribution of technology. And I was thinking, I think there would also be an analogy if you would make a map, although that is harder to make, between free speech and where free speech is more or less possible.
Yeah.
So, and Marx was also in the center of capitalism.
Wow,
so in one of those zones,
yeah.
and that's where it's getting
that is really interesting. And what about human rights? You know,
exactly.
I think in this recent discussion we had, you know, following not least the American elections, I listened to what's her name, Angela Merkel, right? When she was saying Europe and America have always represented human rights, democracy, liberalism, you know, respect for other people. And I thought to myself, my God, is this the role of Europe and the United States in the world? You know, it's like to citizens of Europe, to people who are within the borders, there is human rights, there is freedom of speech, all these things that are so nice. It doesn't mean that we're treating the rest of the world with those premises morally. So once again, it's a zero-sum game. We displace oppression and exploitation to others in order for our own borders to maintain some image of self-congratulatory democracy, human rights, and freedom.
We live in the slave house.
Pardon?
We live in this plantation house on the...
Yes, exactly, and the slaves are out there. It's one huge plantation, absolutely right. Okay, but I would like to, I can very well understand the urge to express your critical stance vis-a-vis this system by jettisoning, abandoning everything that could be connected to colonialism, including rationality. But I think that's not the right way to go about it, as I argue in that article. I think, like Marx, we need to maintain, even if it is a product, I would say it's a reaction. You say he's a product of colonialism. He's a reaction to colonialism, but like we were saying, aren't we all? We're living in this system, which is still, in a sense, colonial. And we have various ideas about how to challenge it. So we're all living in sort of some kind of a post-colonial or anti-colonial situation where we want to react to it. And in that sense, I suppose we are products. I mean, Amazonian Indians 1,000 years ago didn't have to deal with that, but we have to deal with it. How do we dismantle global capitalism? How do we challenge engineers? How do we challenge economists? And we won't do it by crochet artwork.
But sorry,
I don't think I'm going to change them.
No, but I really, I appreciate. Like, I'm very happy to be that I listened to your lecture yesterday, and I appreciate a lot these differentiations. Which are you doing? And then in this argument, I wonder, and if there is, of course, we all should maybe like really engage our activities to dismantle the global capitalism and to really make a shift, because otherwise this shift is not happening. Yeah. But I think also this like
there are different levels of being political, maybe, because maybe with this broadery, or that, I don't know, people are sitting, knitting together, maybe they start to tell stories.
Quite possible.
So on which, of course, this is maybe not the really right thing to change the economics, yeah, but maybe maybe within a group of like 30 people spending 1 month together in a meaningful way, which is so important, as you said yesterday.
Well,
yes,
it probably changes the people involved.
Yeah.
I agree.
So,
and like I said, I have made such a small impression after 35 years of arguing this way. So I'm probably no more effective than if I was doing, you know, embroidery or brochure.
Yeah,
but I still have the hope that if this financial system collapses, people will be looking, politicians will be looking for other ways of understanding what's happening. And they won't be looking at crochet artwork.
No.
They'll be looking at alternative economic theories.
Yeah. No, but I think also to see like what kind of like machines, or what kind of technologies of thought also do we need when? No? I mean, this is, I think, like, this is all what you say in the rest of your argument. Also, like what are the purpose for what? No?
Yeah. Well, there are of course many different ways of many different ways of acting in this system, acting critically. I guess I'm on the defensive side, trying to defend my own choice in my own life. I mean, like everybody, I've been facing a choice. When I was 23 years old, my wife and I moved out into the countryside and left the university and said, we're going to raise sheep and grow potatoes. You know, this was part of the early 70s. Then after a while, I got heavier and heavier into debt. And I realized after a while I had to apply for research funding in order to be able to finance my sheep. I mean, my objective was to have sheep so as not to have to apply for research funding, but then I had to get research funding to have my sheep. Yeah, and then I got into academia more and more. So I mean, we're all faced with choices. How do we deal with this system that we don't like? And I'm not saying there's one solution. I'm just telling you about my choices.
I just want to comment on the crocheting for coral. It reminds me very much of 1 million T-shirts for Africa.
What?
1 million T-shirts for Africa.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if any of you know this story. Somebody in America decided that Africa needed help. This very vague concept of poor Africans and how can we help them. Let's make 1 million T-shirts for Africa. We can send them to Africa for the Africans. And the project obviously failed and didn't get anywhere. People pointed out quite accurately, 1, the Africans didn't want your T-shirts. 2, what was this going to do to their local economies? And 3, how did it help? How did it help anybody with any situation, sending them a T-shirt? So this is often, I think, when people say we must do something, they're desperate to grab something or go beyond just being aware of it, so awareness raising in others, but it doesn't reach the level of efficacy, it doesn't actually make a change. And I think this is what you're critiquing really, is that people are floundering around looking for some way to make a difference, and this isn't one. This is counterproductive. It's moving their energies from doing something which really would make a difference into distracting.
I would agree with you, and I could give you another example which I believe slightly more in. We had a graduate student from Kenya, did his PhD in human ecology, and he wrote a thesis. I asked him to write it that way, on ecologically unequal exchange. And then, of course, with his PhD from Lund University, he went back to Kenya and now has a job in the Kenyan administration. But he's got ecologically unequal exchange in the back of his mind. And hopefully, you know, like rings on the water, he'll have people thinking in those terms and challenging the economist. And I think it's better than T-shirts. So I guess this is why I want to defend the idea of actually working analytically with these issues.
This is what I liked about your proposed do you call it double currency?
Well, I'd call it so many things. Complementary currency. CC, complementary currency.
Well, your CC, this is what I like. There seems like a practical solution that could be tried if you could find a culture or people that were willing to give it a go.
That's the big problem.
And if you can find that, it becomes an actual living lab. So if you could find a living lab, I mean, there have been lots of currency experiments. Art money is one that I'm quite interested in the concept of.
Well, you know, I've had politicians from local municipalities in Sweden who have heard me talk about it and said, I want to try that in our municipality, just as an experiment. And I said, well, great, do that. But of course, nothing has happened.
I can give you a contact that might help with that. A guy called John Rogers.
Like what?
John Rogers. He wrote a manual on how to set up community currencies. Before he did that, he used to live in Wales. He's just become a German citizen now because of Brexit. This is what we're all facing as British. But he worked with the local council there, and they had spare capacity in swimming pools, for example. Swimming pools open in the day and nobody comes. Why? Because they haven't got any money. Why haven't they got any money? Because they haven't got any jobs. So how can we give them the possibility to come there? Well, we'll get them to pick up litter, which we can't afford to pay for. And because they pick up litter, we'll give them a token and they can go to the swimming pool. So he worked with some local councils to do this. So he might have a municipality that could
The problem I have with Sweden is Sweden is about the most eco-modernist country in the world. I think it's more modernist than the United States. And it's very difficult to get anybody, even at the very local level, anybody who has a political position, to think out of the box, outside of the box. They're all into economic growth and new technology and blah, blah.
Even the Greens?
Well, yes. Oh my God! I could tell you about the Greens. About 30 years ago, I was there. I helped them found the party. I would never vote for the Greens. I'm sorry, I shouldn't get political about it. But you know, one of our main politicians, it was all through the campaign. He was waving around a lump of coal, and saying, actually, the Swedish government owns a huge. It owns a huge power company called Vattenfall, and Vattenfall owned a coal mine in Germany, Ende Gelände. Some of you may have heard about it. And about a year ago, the question came up whether Vattenfall was going to sell this coal mine, and there was a strong political opinion in Sweden: no, don't sell it, because that just means continued use of fossil fuels, you know. And this green guy that I'm talking about, he was in government. So if he ever had a chance to stop something, he could have. No. They sold the mine to a Czech company, made billions of dollars, and now they're producing coal like never before. And this is with a green politician in charge. So sorry, I shouldn't get into it. Yeah. So this is just an illustration of how difficult it is to get politicians to be seriously engaged in trying to change things. Yeah. Well, I should just rush through this. I realize okay, so I mean that subjects can be treated as objects and objects can be treated as subjects. When objects are treated as subjects, this is what I call, this is fetishism. When subjects are treated as objects, it's cruelty, it's detachment, it's dissociation. It's the way we treat animals. It's the way we treat people in modernity. I think about it sometimes when I go to a supermarket and I pay for my commodities. There's a person sitting there in the cash register. It's a human being. But I feel sometimes guilty of treating this human being as a machine. She's just there to give me change for my money. She has become an object for me. Now, it doesn't mean that the subject-object distinction is incorrect. It just means that in modernity, we are treating subjects as if they were objects, animals and other people. But we also make the opposite mistake of treating objects, like machines, as if they were subjects. So I think the solution must be to have a clearer distinction between those entities in our environment that are subjective, that are subjects, dogs, even trees, and of course, other human beings. And we should remember to treat them as subjects. And we should not confuse things like machines.
This is an ethical argument. This is ethics.
Yes, absolutely. I haven't studied ethics, but I imagine that would be.
I mean, this makes me, as I try to reproduce the way how they end up with this critique of object-subject dichotomy. It always starts that they say, I would say, Latour and Isabel Stenger as mastermind, yeah, kind of. The question is not, and they are phrasing it differently already. They are not talking about objects. Latour is talking about institutions, things. You know, the Ferguson machine you were mentioning yesterday. What's it? the tractor, what's
Massey Ferguson tractor.
Tractor.
Yeah.
So the same, what Latour would say about it, not trucks or tractors are driving. It's not the airplane that is flying. It's airlines that run airplanes. The institution is doing that. So and that because the thing is something that is composed as a collective between those famous human and non-humans, right? And this holds, and these kind of entanglements, not morally now framed, are then by modernists, as a result, always split up into an object and a subject, and a society and a culture or a nature. Society, culture, and nature. And he said, and they said, it's not a very good idea analytically to start for analysis by those compositions of beings for sociology or other disciplines. It's not a good idea to do that. And this is, I think, quite an interesting idea to ask ourselves to have a refreshed approach to problems in our world. Otherwise, you get in the danger, and Isabel stands for much more than Bruno Latour is always pointing at that you end up in the problem that, for instance, I could call you Lenin 2.0. Well, Lenin was writing a little pamphlet against Mach and Bogdanov and Avenarius called Imperial Criticism in the name of the proletariat. And so you are maybe also having these, telling them, hey guys, you are looking at the wrong place. You know, this is something we have to believe in materialism. We have to believe in a pre-given world where our mind is constructing or concluding the right form or the right knowledge from this in a correspondence setup. Yeah. So I know this is something where I'm asking you now, and just one more sentence. And how to avoid to speak in the name of an abstract category. That's Isabel Stenger's problem. How to avoid that. And pragmatist, and it's a pragmatist philosophy, you know that, you mentioned it somewhere. And it's also mentioned in pragmatist philosophy, also mentions consequences. Yeah. And how can we think about our own consequences? And I think the whole approach then has to do with this. And now not denigrating these little small-scale things like knitting and trying to save the world. But Isabel Stenger in her capitalist sorcery is talking about how to make people think, how to slow down, how to do this on in the name of an abstract category like reason, rationality, whatever. That proved to be a problem because we destroyed the Marxism in the applied form destroyed whole countries in a certain way, we could say.
I mean, you guys are into philosophy. I shouldn't be mentioning. I shouldn't be mentioning Descartes, you know, but I think he's very relevant here. And let me know if I've got Descartes wrong. I may have, you know, but I think a lot of people now are throwing around this thing about Cartesian dualism. Cartesian dualism. Subject-object dichotomy, that's Descartes. It's Cartesian and it should be abandoned. I see even some Marxists like Jason Moore doing this now, you know. Let's not be Cartesian. And I'm wondering whether we are reading too much into Descartes. You could tell us whether or not. Because as far as I know, Descartes had this idea that there was a complete distinction between mind and body, between perhaps the subject and the object of the human organism. He also had an idea that all animals were just body. They had no souls. Dogs were just complicated machines. Now, to discuss dualism critically today and say that it all comes from Descartes, I think is simply wrong. Because his mind-body dualism is not the same kind of dualism as, for example, nature-society dualism. It doesn't derive from Descartes.
I think I would say it does, but I would not say, I mean, it's always wrong to call a philosopher to be blamed for this, but I think he just uttered something which was in the air of his time. I mean, the nature-culture division is, for example, much more explicit in Bacon.
It
Contemporary.
goes back to classical Greece.
Yes, of course. But this is where, and as I read Descartes, I read him as a Platonist, but a Platonist who sees that Platonism, as it was taught for 1,500 years in academia, is in a huge crisis. And this crisis happens exactly because of globalization now being at his time about 150 years old. So there are different cultures, and like his whole project starts because he's just seeing, okay, I've been taught in this academic way, and it doesn't really work any longer.
Yeah.
And he's ready to doubt everything and to see where do we go. And there's a point where really everything falls apart, where he's saying, maybe all my concepts come from the body and I'm nothing else but a body.
Does Descartes say that?
There's a moment in his meditation where he's reflecting on that.
That's interesting.
And then he's saying, but then nothing makes any sense anymore. And he withdraws with that for no real reason other than fear, I would say. And then I think he's reiterating a Platonist model of dualist thought by radicalizing it, by radicalizing something which is already potent and latent in Platonism, but it's not outspoken in the way as Descartes does it, because then Descartes, since he's facing crisis and a problem, he's seeing, oh shit, I have to do the really big step and I have to swallow the entire transcendental abstract categories. Like they have to be all within me, and they're clearly not my body because my body is reacting weird and I'm feeling, this is a famous example, of feeling a limb which has been cut off from me. Those kind of problems that I have, so it cannot be the body. I also see things and the distance is not clear, there's illusions, so it has to be my mind. So he's creating this abstract category. As always, I think one has to distinguish between Descartes and Cartesianism, as one has to distinguish between Plato and Platonism, because Descartes was much more smart, because he published a book where also the thing is in it where actually my thoughts come from the body. And I mean, he must not have wrote this, so he's also just performing an act of thinking and arriving at a result, as well as Plato is performing a mode of thinking, a mode of dialogue, in which one result is there, but there's still a way to it. And then what emerged out of Descartes, Cartesianism, then really developed the nature-culture division, male-female division, I would say.
Okay, well then it is Descartes that I'm criticizing then. Okay, fine. Because I actually cannot accept that the distinction between subject and object is the same distinction as between nature and culture. Could you check the next slide and see if it might be the one I'm hoping? Yes, it is! Okay. So I'm saying the distinction between subject and object, which perhaps goes back to Descartes then, or was articulated particularly clearly by him, is not the same as the one between culture and nature. And I try to demonstrate that in this four-field diagram. I would say that there are natural subjects and cultural objects, which runs against the traditional Cartesian, or the idea about Descartes as separating subject-object, society, nature, culture, nature, as if they were the same thing. But I would say that an artifact, for example, in the lower right-hand corner, is an object, but it's cultural. I would say that sentience in a dog, for example, is natural, but it's a subject. It's a natural subject. So the subject-object dichotomy and the society-nature dichotomy are not congruent. They intersect. And I think this could be then a critique of much of the Cartesian model. I should read up on Descartes before I start talking about Descartes. But a lot of the people like Jason Moore are throwing around this critique of Descartes as if every kind of dualism we have is always Cartesian. And I think it has to be much more nuanced, much more subtle, because I don't think we have analytical grounds for abandoning either of these distinctions. There is a distinction between subject and object. I mean, ontologically, realistically, this is the reality we live in. There's a difference between a rock and a dog. And there's also a difference between thermodynamics and capitalism, for example. There's a difference between the laws of thermodynamics that, as far as we can gather, have been around for a number of billion years, and capitalism, the market economy, which has been around for, say, 300 years. And we have to, if we can't distinguish between nature and society, the natural and the social, then we're not going to understand global warming or capitalism, because it brings together thermodynamics, as I showed yesterday, and the market principle. Okay, I want to finish this. Could you see what the next slide is like? Okay, this you might like. I was sitting there eating breakfast with Bruno Latour in Rio de Janeiro, and I tried to get an idea on how to argue about the difference between the subjective and the objective. And I realized that I could express this by comparing a coin and a key. Now, both of these, they're little pieces of metal, and both of them are artifacts. And you could argue that both these artifacts have been delegated agency. Both of them can open doors. You can open a door with a key, of course, but you can also open a door by giving somebody a coin, and he'll open the door for you. I would argue that the artifact on the left is magical. The artifact on the right is what we usually think of when we talk about technology. The key opens the door because of the physical properties of the artifact itself. It fits in the lock. It's an aspect of the artifact in itself. The coin opens the door not because of its intrinsic properties, but because of how it is perceived by a subjective human mind. That's a Swedish coin, by the way. If I had that with me here in Austria, it would not have opened the door. Nobody would have recognized the coin. It would not be part of the subjective universe that Austrians live in. So, the artifact to the left requires a subjective human mind. The artifact to the right does not. Its agency is objective. It's part of the item itself. Now, I don't know if this makes sense, but I think it's very important for various reasons. And I think the next slide is the final one. Because if we understand, if we understand modern technology, like this machine that is destroying the rainforests of Amazonia, as an artifact in the key sense, in the sense that it's able to operate because of its intrinsic physical properties, this is only half the story. Because if you remember what I said yesterday, the reason that this machine has these physical properties is because we have a market, a world market, where different kinds of commodities are evaluated by subjective human actors on the market. Okay, I'll pay you $300 for this and for that. So the technology, it looks objective. It looks like it had its own internal logic. The machine is a world unto itself. It is independent of any subjective perceptions. But if we reinsert the technology into the world market, we see that it is contingent on human subjectivity, on how we evaluate things that are traded on the market. So this is, my most recent book is called Global Magic. By the way, it's going to be out in paperback soon. Padraig Macmillan. It was incredibly expensive when it was, you couldn't possibly buy it. Only the libraries bought it. It was like 79 euro or something. But anyway, now it's going to be, there's a pocket edition. It's called Global Magic. And the reason I call it Global Magic is because it's about the way technologies are really magical. They are magic, in the sense that they make us believe that they have an interior agency that is not contingent on human beliefs. But ultimately, they do. Ultimately, they are contingent on human beliefs. That machine looks like it has power in itself. But without the world market that provides it with fuel and metals and so on, without all these human subjects that have traded all these things on the market, it would not operate, it would not exist. So, and this is for me the very essence of magic. I don't know if you've seen a magician in the act sometime, but his whole point is to fool you, to make you think that there's a rabbit in the hat. And it's not supposed to be accepted as part of your subjective understanding of what he's doing. You are completely baffled. The hat is magical. There's a rabbit coming out of the hat. And I'm saying machines are exactly the same kind of phenomenon. It's just that we are all fooled. We are the magician's audience. We're looking at the machines and we're not understanding the extent to which they are products of beliefs, subjective beliefs. This is finally where the subjective and the objective meet. And we are fooled, like previous cultures have been fooled by their particular kinds of magic. But this is our magic, and this is the magic that we have to expose. The magicians have no clothes. The emperor has no clothes. The magicians have no clothes. Okay, I stopped there. I'm sorry for going on so long. Gosh. Okay, but we're having to one, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That was the final.
The timing is great. I think we need a break. Is it right?
Yes.
So we have. What time is it? When I may
It's
ask?
almost 11.
So quarter of an hour. Okay. And then we continue.
15 minutes.
Next round.
You want my email?
Yes, please. Yes.
So we were thinking about opening now this last 100 minutes, and we have 1 hour and 40 minutes, so until 1 o'clock, to yourself, to your ideas, for those who have been yesterday attending the lecture. I think they maybe have asked some questions, and to listen to some of your thoughts, ideas, being, I don't know, some different, there are different backgrounds, of course, of people sitting here. From your perspectives, what else ideas and conclusions also imply for us, and open it for discussion. And if nobody wants to say anything, Kilian has a small intervention, maybe no other intervention, comment from his perspective. So yes, are there any comments or further?
Can I just ask one quick question? Is this about what you're going to do in the woods in Ukraine, or about everything that we've done that's very open, or the Anthropocene, or is there some boundary or no boundary?
What is the boundary in between what?
You want us to give comments and thoughts in a workshop. Is it purposive for the trip that you want to make in Ukraine?
Yeah, no, yes,
Okay.
there is no boundary.
Okay.
You can be open for
Whatever.
whatever, of course. We won't compromise our project. So, Johanna.
After your lecture, we have spoken in a small group, and we were asking ourselves, so if this new currency, would work, within these 50 kilometers, people would use that money, and so you could, besides, for example, if you want to work and get this other, the new normal money as well, but that wouldn't make any difference for between rich and poor, because the rich would still have their amount of money and could buy everything they wanted, and the people who could only use this local currency would pretty much then have the problem to have access to other things which are not locally produced.
Yeah. Okay, I see your point. So that you don't think it necessarily would change the big inequalities in society. Okay. I can see that point, but like so many other aspects of this system, what I would hope is that in the long term, it would change the conditions for inequality. Because a lot of the people that are rich today are so because of the way the current economy operates. They work for large multinational corporations and make money on long-distance trade. But if I mean, this is a utopia, I know, but if a majority of people in the world were to localize their economies, it would transform the very conditions of capital accumulation, and these wealthy people would not make money in the same way anymore. That's one aspect, and that's a more long-term aspect. But in the short term, I would argue that all these people who would receive a basic income that they could survive on, they would, I would imagine, at least that's what my students tell me, in Sweden, they would have a different sense of self-identity. They would not consider themselves unemployed, some part of society that has been discarded because society couldn't find use for them. It would give them a position to do what they want with their own lives and their own identities without relying on some abstract employer somewhere. And it would also make it possible for them to survive without having to sell their time. I mean, if you really think about it, what we're doing when we're getting a job is finding a market for our time, for our lives. We're selling our hours, our days, our weeks, our months, and getting paid for it. We become commodities. And this is, of course, Marx's basic objection to proletarianization, that human lives become commodities. And this would be a way of getting around that. But I realize it's not like a revolution. It doesn't mean, you know, you can't get rid of the capitalist class like with one blow of a guillotine or something.
Okay. Couldn't you just do that with a regular currency? Like in Finland now, they've introduced a basic income. Is that not going to happen there with the taxation?
Basic income?
Yeah. For unemployed people who've been unemployed for a certain length of time can now get this for 2 years, I think it is.
I was in Finland last fall. I was invited to talk about this. And I think it's extremely interesting what is happening in Finland. But my objection would be the same as I had against the Bristol pound yesterday. That the money that people get as basic income can be used to buy products from Japan or California. It doesn't enhance local production and local consumption. It's just another way of you know, increasing global trade, basically. Because it increases purchasing power of local people, but it doesn't decrease their involvement in the global economy.
But maybe it only goes to in the Finnish case, it's only going to the poorest people, in which case the goods they buy will be local goods because they need food and the cost of
well, it could be the other way around.
You think it's the other way
At least that's the way I see it in Sweden. The poorest people buy the stuff that comes from farthest away, because Brazilian meat is much cheaper than Swedish meat because of the land and labor costs in Brazil. So in fact, by giving a basic income to the poorest people, you are actually endorsing globalization.
May I step in here? I'm not entirely sure whether that is true, because if you look at your kind of, at what you all are expenses, where do they go? I think the poorest people, 50% at least, goes into renting a house.
Renting a...
into...
Okay.
Housing. Yeah? And this is local. It's a local good they buy.
Many housing companies are huge transnational companies.
Maybe, but isn't, I mean, if I rent, would that be, so let me put it a question. Is the renting of a house or a flat, is that a local product or not? First question.
That's my 27th question.
Second, which is perhaps even as important, second thing is health. Health services. This is what we all buy health services locally, rich or poor. This is not a globalized market. It's difficult to globalize. Education. There are many things which are already local, and which I believe the poor people, they would spend, if you look at that, at their portfolio, I would have thought they spend 80% of their expenses goes into these local products, and
local products
in that sense,
and services.
There's products and services, products and services, of course. Yeah. And this meat thing, okay, but this is marginal. If you look at the whole portfolio, what they're buying.
No, I don't know if I agree with you, actually. I mean, at least from my Swedish horizon, I know that most of my friends who have low income, they would go to the new department stores that import electronics from China or food from South America and so on, because they're cheaper.
True. Of course,
they don't buy the Swedish stuff because it's so damn expensive.
But they wouldn't spend, I mean, look at the portfolio of a household. Of course, they spend quite a lot of money on electronics, but it is still a minor part. It's 10% or so. The bulk goes into other things, and this is locally produced.
Well, let me just say in an evasive way here that, of course, I can't answer all questions, right? But what I think is that some of these issues that you raise are really intriguing and deserve to be discussed. For example, how do we deal with housing? How do we deal with health? How do we deal with schooling? I don't have any kind of answers, but I could probably, if I sat down and thought about it for a while, come up with some suggestions. I got a question like that recently because I published a piece on something called The Conversation. I don't know if you know that. It's a kind of a global digital discussion forum. And somebody asked me, what about electricity? And I was sort of at a loss. And then I thought, well, for one thing, if people want to use their notes to buy electricity, it would be one way of encouraging local electrical production through solar panels, windmills, small water hydroelectric power stations. So, I mean, you could probably find a way of turning this purchasing power in the notes into a force for transforming society in many ways, in addition to the ones that I've talked about. And I'm sure schooling and medical services and housing could also be organized so as to be accessible through this local currency. But it would require a lot of practical political thinking how to do that, administrative thinking.
You need kind of labels, like we have the equal label today.
Yeah, certification scheme.
A certification.
Exactly. Yes.
This product is considered to be local according to certain rules and controlled by certain bodies.
Absolutely. And it's no more difficult than certifying organic produce or anything else. All you need is a GPS device to show. I mean, even the taxis have them. Every single taxi has. You ask them, you know, where, you give them an address and they check the computer where to go. The whole world, I know you've probably seen Google Earth. And I can check out the places I've been to in Peru in detail on Google Earth. We have the technology, I shouldn't be saying that, but we have the possibility of dealing with the information we need and that's one of the few things that I actually believe technology can give us, is the information to organize a society, like information, not material form. Okay.
I mean, just what I found interesting yesterday about this thought of this complementary currency.
Yeah.
Is also that I am interested in this issue of unconditional basic income.
Yeah.
And I think also, which is also complementary, because of course the social state, like all the parameters we have for health and education or so, they should keep running. Like the unconditional basic income cannot cover up with all these other issues. And I think it's also this question of unconditional or not, like in Sweden, if you are unemployed and you get money in order to be part of the society, it's not changing really. But this issue of unconditional basic income, so that you say everyone, no matter if you are rich or poor, but you get a certain amount for this freedom of being part of a culture, and also of this freedom that you are, at least to a certain amount, You can decide how you want to spend your own time, and you can negotiate what kind of work you want to do. Because if your existence is like there, then maybe you don't have to work for €5 an hour or something. And then again, this production circulation is shifted and changed. So
there is a problem in relation to what you were saying before about health costs. Because unfortunately, we all want to stay healthy. We want to live as long lives as we can. But we have to think health also as being dependent on technology, and in that respect also being an issue of global distribution. And I mean, I'd like to see figures. I'd like to see a world map, you know. And you talked about some aspects that could be mapped. What about longevity, for example, you know, or where I know Europe is doing very well, but we know that a lot of the technology that keeps our 90-year-olds alive is based on a lot of fossil energy that is killing children in Africa and South America.
There are also many caretakers who are leaving their families. I don't know how it is.
Yeah.
And come and work and stay here for 1 month.
That's true.
And I mean, there is a whole currency of people of caretaking, because we don't
Carers.
Carers, yeah. Carers.
Carers, because a caretaker is a janitor.
Oh, okay.
Sweeps the floor.
Yes.
Okay,
Right.
carers, yeah.
So in your terms of who's using external labor, the elderly would be the biggest exploiters in a way. You remember your
Yes.
statistics?
Columns, yeah.
The columns. So if you split that in younger and elderly, it would be quite interesting.
Especially now that Europe is getting older and older. So we need all the immigrants. This is what we're being told all the time. Somebody has to take care of us. No, but this is a major problem, and I think the health issue, because of it, it is a global zero-sum game. A lot of it. I mean, we maintain our European health at the cost of ill health in other parts of the world, and I don't know how to deal with that really. But I guess one consolation would be to say that a lot of our expenditures for medicine in Europe is to take care of people who have eaten too much or worked too little. That in fact we're using medical technology to sort of heal ourselves from the ills of being wealthy and affluent. And I don't know, I mean, there are records from when I've been working with the Micmac Indians in Nova Scotia in Canada, and looking at the historical records, the first French fur traders who came to Nova Scotia in the early 17th century, they found the Micmac people to be exceptionally healthy, and there were very many very old people and so on. Of course, 200 years later, their longevity had really gone down. This is like what I said about Africa yesterday, and so on. And the same, James Cook said the same thing about Polynesia, that people were extremely healthy before the Europeans came. So I'm not sure that we need all this medicine. Maybe it's just a way of keeping people alive in this terrible lifestyle we have of sitting all day, sitting in our cars, and eating all this fat stuff and all these sugars, you know. Maybe we don't need really that kind of technology. I mean, I think of Cuba. When Cuba, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I just read yesterday that the average Cuban lost 4 kilograms of weight. Now that wasn't a bad thing, because cardiovascular disease also decreased markedly in Cuba, because the Cubans started living a more healthy life. Now, I don't know, but I think that for Americans it would obviously make a lot of sense to spend a little bit less money on fossil fuels, fats and sugar.
May I connect to this? For me then, personal view on when I listen to the way how you suggest this solution, then my question anyway comes up: how do you think, or others here in this room, think about our so-called Western locked-in societies? So any change in our society is a big problem. If we talk to health administrators, social insurance administrators, ask them, how do you think a system could change? They look at each other and say, a war, a disaster, something you can't change it. No. So how could we improve our attitude in our world that allows us to have a more experimental attitude? So what could be so difficult to implement complementary currency in some place? What's the problem? I don't know exactly where we try it out and then see, okay, what is the problem to change some things in our schools? In the healthcare system, yes, I'm with you, I'm studying healthcare system quite closely. And this is related to, you read Ivan Illich and the nemesis of medicine, and you were reading Jean-Pierre Dupuy and his calculations on how systems turn against the purpose of the system and destroy where they are good for, transportation system, medical system, and others. Yeah? So that's my question. Where is our experimental attitude that we allow ourselves to experiment with things without being so, it's not then in stone, we can change it again and try it out. So what's the problem? So maybe there are maybe it's the wrong question, I don't know, but it has something to do with the question of participation and who is taking over the responsibilities. Can we share this? Is it then that we say many of us say, yes, we would like to change it? Or do we need to have some burden, what's the English? Crisis.
Catastrophe. But we do need to have that. That's what's happening now. Where the transition town movement is growing. We talk about the sixth extinction, and you talk about the Anthropocene. But I think when you use that word, you're also hinting at the idea that we have an anthropological problem that's been created on the Earth with massive overpopulation, technologies. Maybe it's a manifestation of that. Maybe it's engineered or caused that. And this is something that I think we talk about this one solution, the little economics thing. Having said you don't like economics. And don't like engineers. It's almost like
localization strategy, but it's administered by
what's actually the problem? When we talk about a complex or a wicked problem, I know it's difficult to give a kind of problem for a solution, but is the problem that we now want to move somewhere else? Where do we want to go?
Okay, I'd like to get back to that nasty review I wrote of Donna Haraway, because in her book, Staying with the Trouble, she refers to a science fiction novel called The Dithering. And I had to look the word dithering up in my dictionary, and I'll get to it in a little while, but it's quite interesting because a large part of her book is actually pure science fiction. She's imagining how the world might look in 400 years' time. And she is referring to another science fiction novel, not by Ursula Le Guin, which she refers to a lot, but some other author, I forgot his name now, who wrote a book called The Great Dithering, I think. And dithering, in my dictionary, is a state of agitated confusion. Agitation and confusion. Agitated, angry confusion, the dithering. And in this science fiction novel, there is a future historian looking back at our period and calling the period between the year 2000 and 2050 the Great Dithering. The period in which we're all dithering. And I'm being really vicious with Donna Haraway because I say, well, if this is the name of if her book is representative of our age, then yes. The Great Dithering is a good
name of the book.
Yes. And I know it's very impolite, but anyway, the crochet artwork and all this stuff. So in response to what you were saying, I think there's a lot, I know there's a lot of fear of climate change and collapse, financial collapse and so on. And I think a lot of the reason why Bruno Latour and Donna Haraway and others have been given so much space for dithering, if I may say so, is because we're all rather prone to dithering at this point. We really don't know how to handle the fact that the planet is being destroyed by our very way of living, by our daily consumption styles. How do we handle that? How do we change our lives so as to save the planet? And how do we decide collectively to do that, not just individually? Of course there's no solution. immediately. But I think, that's why I think it's very important to build visions and utopias for the future. And maybe for me it's a kind of a teddy bear to have this utopia of the local economy, localized economy. But I think it's very important to have some kind of possible vision in a situation. I mean, let's say that we were suddenly to hear on the news that we're facing a new financial collapse, which is worse than we had in 2008. I remember actually in 2008, and maybe it's weird, but because I was actually sitting in hope that things would finally change. You know, that's how desperate I was after 30 years almost when I heard the news from the United States, they said one week, if the United States is not able to borrow so and so many $100 billion by Tuesday, it will no longer be able to pay out the pensions to the retired people. And I was thinking, okay, this is it. This is the point, you know. Now things are going to change. Now it's for real. And of course, now we're back in normal reality. But I'm thinking, when those news, I'm not saying if, I'm saying when the news arrive that we're heading toward a global collapse. Of course, it's not a good news. It won't be, because it'll be highly problematic. But on the other hand, the news we receive today about the world are not very good either. So I don't think the news would be worse if they said the system is going to collapse. I think, in fact, that would be good news compared to the news we're getting now on rising carbon dioxide emissions, rising global inequalities, 2.3 billion people living on $2 a day, and so on and so on. The news we're getting on the world are pretty bad. So I'm thinking, if we could get those news and say, all right, now let's meet up. I live in the countryside in Sweden. Let's get together and decide how we might organize our local economy. Who can grow vegetables? Who can fish? Who can bring in the firewood? How do we survive now that the money is gone, now that the electricity is gone, now that perhaps even the internet is gone? Now I know this sounds like catastrophe, but I really think we need to prepare ourselves. I've made a garden for myself, and I know from when I was younger, I could keep my family alive on that garden. And I think we all need to think in those terms, rather than just continuing to rely on an abstract system of unequal exchange to keep us alive. Sorry for being a harbinger of bad news, but I think this is something we need to think about, all of us.
Yeah, just.
I mean, I have a question or a problem with this, or I think I'm just much more pessimistic at this, because what if...
You're more pessimistic?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Good for you.
I mean, what if we are already in a state of collapse, and the reaction to the state of collapse is exactly what's happening, which is Trump and Erdogan and all this.
A lot of people are arguing that. Yeah.
And we will just become more fascist, and we will build walls around the wealthy areas, exploiting the poorest even more effectively with locking them out completely. Like, how can we assume that in collapse or after collapse, people will deal nicer with each other, not even more vicious?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I see your point there. But you know, people are reevaluating the Middle Ages. For a long time, at least during the Enlightenment, the Middle Ages were called the Dark Ages. Rome was great, and then the Renaissance was great, but in between were the Dark Ages. But there are people now who are saying that for the general population of Europe, for example, the Dark Ages were much better than either Rome or the Renaissance, in terms of health, in terms of tax burdens. I know one archaeologist from the States who expressed it very nicely, said, well, some people experience the collapse of Rome or the ancient Maya as a tax relief. So maybe we should reevaluate history also. And I've been looking, for example, at the long-term history of Peru. Believe it or not, I've been doing some ethno-archaeological work in Peru as well. And you can see periods of horizons, like there's the early horizon, the middle horizon, the late horizon. The late horizon was the Inca Empire. But in between them you have intermediate periods with a more localized social, in between the empires you have more local societies. And there's a lot of evidence. Well, there was originally, of course, a lot of violence in connection with the collapse. But after that, you see some kind of resurgence. I think the more we are prepared psychologically, existentially, philosophically, whatever, for a collapse, the better. The more of a chance that we will survive. And in case you feel a great hopelessness and despondency about this, after your very pessimistic comment, I'd like you to look at something on Google, which I found quite interesting. Some of you may have heard about it. It's called the Dark Mountain Movement. Have you heard about that? No. Dark Mountain Society. In Sweden it's grown quite strong, but I think it began in England. I met up with one of the leaders, he's from England, a while ago. And these are people, I'll just say they're people who have given up on the civilization. They don't believe in technology or economics. They don't believe in eco-modernization. But they still have hope that humanity will find a decent way of living beyond the collapse. And they're very much into culture and art. I think this might interest many of you, because, and they work on how do we create a new awareness, a new sense of experiencing the world beyond the collapse, you know, because they consider the collapse is not a question of if, it's a question of when. And then they're working on getting together around a way of understanding the future beyond the collapse.
Isn't it also a question about the how?
Pardon?
Isn't it also a question about the how?
Yeah.
How do we imagine this collapse? Are we already in the center of the collapse, maybe, or in the beginning? Or, you know, how do we, speaking about the collapse, how do we imagine that collapse? Or how do you imagine that?
It's something for a science fiction novel, I think.
No,
I think that's what Haraway should be writing about.
No, we should just, I mean, there was a collapse in 29.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There are historical parallels.
There was a big collapse in 1929.
Yeah, there was.
World crisis.
We should learn from that.
And it is very interesting to read how people talked and perceive these problems, and perceive technology.
Now,
it was really a period where there was enormous amount of talk about technology.
Yes, and what Kilian might add is that 1939 was also the outbreak of the Second World War.
29.
Oh, sorry, 29. You're absolutely right.
No, 29.
But
I mean, 29,
yes, 29, 39, sorry. But Karl Polanyi put a connection between financial instability in the 30s and the Second World War. Of course. Of course,
that is the how.
So there's a lot
because
of
this collapse went, and that is what those of you I think have underlined. It's the how the collapse takes place. Yeah. And this 29 collapse is an example where things went much worse and not better through the collapse.
That's true, and that's why we need a vision to give us another future.
Dreaming of a collapse is for me a difficult, is a dangerous way of thinking.
Well, I don't know if it's dangerous. I think a lot of us keep the idea of collapse away from us because, precisely as you say, it feels dangerous and it gives us a sense of fear. But if we confront it for some time, for example, for 30 years, I think we accept it and we start imagining what is required of us to create a society that operates beyond that. And I mean, once again, it's a question of existential survival.
And one thing is sure, without technology, the 7 billion on the globe will not survive.
I think that we do a lot better without technology.
But 7 billion is not.
Yeah, I mean, part of the eco-modernist story is that if we didn't have fossil fuels, well, that's part of the story, that 2 billion people will starve if we don't have fossil fuels. Don't believe that. Please don't believe that. There is more than a hectare of land per nuclear family in the world. I have supported a family of 4 with a little garden that is smaller than the size of this room. We can do it without fossil fuels. It's not that we need those fossil fuels to keep alive. This is part of the ideology that's keeping the technology.
Wait a minute. Could you please explain that?
Yeah.
I mean, you say there's 4 hectares for nuclear.
No, not 4. I said more than a hectare.
More than a hectare.
Yes, 1.2 or something. But I include pasture land and forest in that.
But this land is not near.
No.
It is far away.
Absolutely, yes.
So that is the problem.
Yeah.
If it was near, then
yes, but what we also have to remember is that a collapse.
Because it is far away, you need transport.
But if you look, I know. But if you look at collapse historically, for example, as Joseph Tainter describes it in this Cambridge volume, The Collapse of Complex Societies, that was published in '88, I really recommend it.
What is the book?
Joseph Tainter, The Collapse of Complex Societies. He has studied the collapse of Rome, the collapse of the Maya, the collapse of ancient Assyria, and so on, the collapse of Easter Island. And in between his lines, you can understand that he also anticipates the collapse of Western civilization. He's an American. But he doesn't say so, which is probably wise. But a lot of people have been writing new books referring to him, because his argument, which is very, very smart and very simple, he says that it's all about diminishing returns on complexity. That each society, each culture keeps investing more and more in some kind of complexity. For example, ancient Rome invested more and more in armies, more and more in slavery. And then he uses this mathematical curve, and he says that in the beginning, the return on those investments is very high. But then it reaches an apex and finally goes down. And that's when societies collapse. When it costs more to invest in the military than what the military can give you. And you can use the exactly same mathematical curve for the Maya theocracies who built their pyramids, and the Aztecs who sacrificed to the gods. The more they sacrifice, the more problems they created. And I would say technology is our complexity. We keep investing in it, and in the beginning it looks good, but I think right now we're up here somewhere. And the whole thing, if you can connect it to, I don't know if you're familiar with the acronym EROI, E-R-O-I, Energy Return on Energy Investment. There is a man called Charles Hall who has investigated this, and he has been comparing different energy systems like fossil fuels, photovoltaic power, and so on, in terms of how much energy you need to put into the technology in relation to how much you get out of it. And he's very pessimistic about photovoltaic power, by the way. But I think the argument is that what I really wanted to say in response to your, I'm sorry I made a long-winded argument, is that he usually finds that a collapse requires about 20 years. It doesn't happen over one night. So there's time to move. There's time for a decline. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not like a traffic accident. Decline is slow, and maybe it started with Trump. You know.
But is this going to work at a global scale if we slow globally? Or is this on
a lot of people are arguing that today, that the world economy is so interconnected, China cannot survive without US consumption. You know. And so China needs the US. It's not like the US will crash and China will survive.
Resource use in China, that can't.
Pardon?
The resource use, the amount of resources pulled into China, this cannot continue. There isn't enough resources in the world at the rate it's been happening over the last 10, 15 years. Huge.
But what?
Sorry, there was Margit.
But she was first, I think.
Who was first? You were first. Margit? Sorry.
Maybe it doesn't really or I skip it, but if it does.
Okay, I have two questions. The first one is about your proposal yesterday. Before you started the proposal of understood correctly, that if we change our currency that reflects the true energy that is cost of that cost for the production of goods, that wouldn't work. The first question is why?
I'm not sure I got you correct, but are you saying that, well, I mentioned yesterday that in the beginning, I should have said in the beginning, by using the local currency, we would free up some of our conventional.
No, it was before you introduced the new currency. So I've been struggling with the same problems. Like I'm from Bolivia, and there I had a clear intuition of the consumption, the production of garbage, and all those. I mean, it was intuitive for me what was more ecological to consume. And here, it's completely. I don't have the senses to complex to understand what's my impact to the environment. I think it's a big problem. So I'm a physicist by training, so my first idea was, okay, to have a global measure of what is the cost of each good, we need a global, we need something that reflects, we need a physical property that reflects what was the cost of it.
Okay, I see.
And the first thing that I thought was the only universal thing is energy. Well, in terms of physics, right? So the first thing is like, if we would have a label of how much energy was consumed to produce every good that we buy, then that would be amazing, because then we would say, okay, I more or less quantify it's my footprint in the
but I don't believe in it. We had this discussion before about tying money to some kind of standard like energy or land or labor or something. And I don't believe in it because I don't think, well, one of the reasons is I don't think the problem is that we don't know. We know.
Do we? I mean,
yes, we do.
For me, it's very hard to, I don't know what's the whole process of bringing a banana from Colombia to here.
But seriously, I mean, let's be honest. Would you really change your lifestyle so much if everything you bought had an energy label on it?
I would at least be able to quantify and say, okay, this is less energy because it was produced nearby here.
But you would still fly here from Bolivia, right?
I did fly from Bolivia.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
I mean, we're all part of the system.
Yeah.
And even though I know it's a very important part of our lifestyle to be ecological consumers and so on, I think in the long run we all know that we belong to the heaviest burden on this planet. We consume many times more resources and have many times larger ecological footprints than most people in Bolivia. So I don't think, for one thing, I don't think it's a question of ignorance. I don't think we need to know more. For the other part, I don't believe that money operates according to a logic that would be compatible with tying it to a standard like energy or land or labor. Because, like Nicolaus Georgescu-Roegen shown, I don't know if you know his work, he wrote a book in 1971 called The Entropy Law and the Economic Process. And he was an economist, but he also studied physics. You came from physics, right? And he had a very important argument. He almost got the Nobel Prize, but he was too subversive, I think. But his argument was basically that anything that you produce in an economic production process, it will increase the exchange value, what economists call utility. But it would, on a physical level, it would also increase entropy. You know what entropy is? Yes. So in other words, how can you have an economy that sort of acknowledges the role of energy and entropy, the physical aspect of the economy, if the more money you make, the more you have destroyed? Okay, what I'm saying is you can't have an energy quantification of commodities, no more than you can have a gold standard, actually, because there will be an inevitable discrepancy, a divergence between what money does and what's happening physically.
That is the problem.
Yes. Okay.
Why is that That's
Well,
the
it's
divergence.
Well, it's the way, I mean, thermodynamics, we won't be able to change thermodynamics, right? But we won't change the second law of thermodynamics. That's one part of the problem. But we can change the other part. We can change the money. Now, the problem is thermodynamics and economics. It's how they fit together. And we can only change one of them. We can change economics. We can't change physics. So we need to change money.
Let me just give
So,
a very brief
Yes.
hint here. We talked about this crisis in '29, the big crisis. There was a movement in the United States called the technocracy.
yes, and they wanted to tie money to energy.
The technocracy movement, the technocrats, they call themselves. Mr. Howard Scott was the leader of that. And it was indeed one of these movements that popped up during that crisis period where everybody was kind of, what do you call it, dithering. Dithering was also there.
Yes,
during this
that's
period.
true.
And the dithering of that period produced the technocrats and the technocracy as a utopia. And the technocrats, their solution was, yes, let's get rid of money in the classical sense and set up an accounting system for energy.
Yep.
And we would account for all goods in energy, and that would be the price tag we put on it. It's interesting to see that this same idea pops up now. It's not to disqualify what you're saying, it's just to give you that hint. It would be interesting, if you're interested in that idea, to look into that movement and why and how it went. It's very interesting.
What's the name of this guy? You know this curve of peak oil? The first guy, is it called the Hubbard curve? Hubble? Oh, you know, the curve according to which we use that much oil and then we'll use less and less. But the first person who designed such a curve over fossil fuels was the leader of the technocrat movement, Hubble.
Howard Scott.
I mean, Howard Scott is one of the leading figures.
Okay, well, I'm thinking of somebody else, but he's also a very important figure in that. And he counted in energy, but he wanted to tie money to energy, exactly as you're, in a way, suggesting there with labeling produce. Actually, one way of dealing with this is what the footprint people have been doing for decades to calculate the ecological footprint of our consumption. And that's a very similar thing, isn't it? I mean, the Mattis Wackernagel, who I know well, he would be able to tell you how many average global hectares each Bolivian and each Austrian and each Swede requires in order to maintain his lifestyle. So there are several attempts, not least in ecological economics, to tie our economic life and consumption to physical parameters. But I don't think that's the solution, though. It's interesting for us to know what our economy is doing to the world and how economists ignore it. That is the point. But I don't think the solution is to connect our money to some biophysical parameter.
Yeah, no, I think that wouldn't work. Right?
No.
It's very difficult to implement. That was my. I stopped thinking about it when I thought.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, it's the most immediate thing to think about.
Okay, I think we have Marit. You were completely forget the question.
I don't know if it fits perfectly, but I think that technology changes a lot. Like what is happening now, most people are talking about biotechnology, about this new CRISP stuff, and if you think about that artificial intelligence, and if I'm wondering if this is not a new quality of technology. Like what we are talking about, I have a feeling it's all kind of ancient technology, where we are faced with a new one that nobody of us understands really, and also the impacts we don't understand. So
this is,
if it's always technology in general, I'm getting skeptic, or I don't know if this does not go hand in hand, and if the one thing can't be like to ignore it. I think in this.
There's a lot of science fiction around about how technology might change things, and I would argue that the eco-modernists have precisely the same kind of story. Well, you know, things are going to change. We're going to reach, what's the name? This moment when technology becomes something else. The singularity. Yeah. And I was thinking once again of Donna Haraway, because in her final chapter in her book, she argues about, you know, she's very much into multi-species relationship, and she wants to, apparently she's a great fan of bioengineering, genetic engineering, and her utopia is that humans are genetically hybridized with other species. And believe it or not, her main character in her science fiction chapter, a girl called Camille, is a symbiont, she calls it, a biogenetic hybrid between a human and a monarch butterfly. And it's beautiful, but it's absolutely crazy. And my question to her is, why is there not in that chapter one mention of the economy of this future community she's talking about? Apparently they have advanced bioengineering. They become half butterflies. But there's not a word on what they eat or what their economy looks like. So I'm worried about the way that some of these post-humanists completely ignore the material substrate of human existence. They have all these fantasies about future technology, but it's not grounded in metabolism. I mean, biotechnology is a very expensive kind of technology that's only available to some of the wealthiest centers of the world.
It's getting cheaper and cheaper.
Is it?
There's a lot of this biohacking kitchen stuff, and they say it can be done with little money already, like also for smaller communities.
And how do you think it will change our dilemma of global change?
The internet changed so much. So it changed a lot. And this is a technology. So for me it made the world completely different than it was before. And therefore I think technology has an impact which is larger than economy
okay.
and politics and whatever.
Yeah. I'll try not to show how skeptical I am, but ask you instead, what can it do for us in the Anthropocene? What can biotechnology do for us to stop this planet from getting too hot for our grandchildren?
I don't want to say it's a solution, but if we are talking about technology and talking about politics and economics, like for example in economics, I think the richest men, they earn their money, most of them earn a lot of money which is combined to data and not to the hardware as such. Therefore there are questions popping up to me if this is not if we are looking for solutions or whatever, if this should be not much more included in the thoughts. Like how if this technology does not have qualities which we are not so much used to or cannot grasp completely, or even not enough parts of it to know what impact.
Well, I mean, I'm intrigued by the idea, but for me, as a sort of political economist, I would be asking, how do we generate a technology that does not embody global inequalities? And then I seriously doubt that we are in a very different situation than our ancestors were in the late 18th century. Because they had for hundreds of years been trying to get the organic economy, horses and so on, to be as efficient as possible. They had worked out new agricultural systems, new ways of using draft animals, and so on and so on. And of course using the solar energy through plants and food, fodder, firewood. And to what extent have humans, it's sort of a Faustian idea that something has happened in our mind since the late 18th century, which makes us, you know, it's a hubris. We have what they didn't have. We have some kind of engineering knowledge that they didn't have. I don't believe that. I believe that the possibility of implementing that engineering knowledge that we're so proud of has to do with the global world economy. And if we get rid of that global world economy, we won't have that technology either. We'll be back where they were. And of course we won't be back because there's no going back in the sense that we have to have a feudal society or something like that. We have a complete freedom to arrange a democratic, just and resilient society. But in terms of our access to technology, I think we'll have resort to the same amount of land, the same amount of labor, the same amount of sunlight, and so on that we had in the 18th century.
What do you do?
One tweet be more isolated, because what I was thinking is that the system you are proposing, you imagine it for a national state because that's what's right now.
Yes, a nation state. Yeah.
Because it is there. But that's a bit going back to having an autarkic system. It's like super taxing the imports kind of. And then also, who would have right to this complementary currency? Because if a nation implements it and the others don't, many people would want to move to this country to benefit from it. Because then, would you have right, like you as a human, would you have also certified to have been produced in 50 kilometers around to be part of this system? Or
well, of course, I mean, the ultimate utopia would be for other nations to, the first step in my utopia is for one nation to actually try this out. Yes. If it works out well, the second step in my utopia would be for the other nations around it to think, well, that's a good idea. You know, but what I'm suggesting is that this would actually decrease the significance of national borders. If you, for example, live in Sweden, 2 kilometers from the Norwegian border, your 50-kilometer radius would extend into Norway.
yes.
So it's not a question of national protectionism.
No, but it can be a lot like that.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that the intention is not that one.
Yeah.
But that it's the first consequences.
Yes, I think it would.
Like that,
Yeah.
and also it would also bring inequality to people who live in areas where the soil is less fertile or where it's too cold to produce.
That's, I think that's question number 23 in my
Yeah, I guess so.
No, but you're right. I often get that kind of questions like, what do? I live in Alaska, you know. And I say, what are you doing in Alaska? You know, I mean, why don't you move somewhere where you can grow food? You know, why do we think it's just natural that you can live anywhere in the Arctic or anywhere and just use fossil energy to import whatever resources you need? That's part of our privilege. I mean, there was a time when people lived where you could grow food, and that to us now sounds hilarious. It sounds funny. Why should we live where you grow food? You can always transport it. I think that's a very strange way of reasoning. I wanted to get back to your question, just a little thing, because I forgot one thing. I believe in the internet.
You believe in the internet?
Yes, I do. And of course that's probably a contradiction with what I was saying before, because in that sense I don't think we can ever, even technologically, go back. Because I hope that we will be able to maintain a global communication. That's not the same thing as maintaining a global material flow structure. We don't want to import ethanol from Brazil, but we want to be able to exchange emails with our colleagues and friends in Brazil. I think it's a big difference. And in terms of energy expenditure, what's spent on the internet, if you forget about some of the stuff that's being done over the internet, is very, very small compared to the total energy budget of modern society. So one caveat for the internet. Okay.
But sorry, I also to you and now to you, because yesterday I was thinking that now with this whole turn of new media, I was thinking the same myth and the same narrative which you explained in the Industrial Revolution. We are hooked with it again, you know. I mean, the major producers of digital media, they have big monopolies. They are they commodifying everything. They are smart in terms of services to control when our heart rate, how we are running, how we are sleeping, when you open your refrigerator, and these are monopoles, yeah, from the richest countries. So how I I mean, I love new technology too, but still then I think like, and still we think, yeah, we're gonna solve it somehow, you know? This gonna, like in 20 years maybe we know how to deal with it, so I would be really interested if there are concrete like visions, different like, because I also don't think, I mean, maybe it's good to think about a crisis, but I don't think that the human nature is built to react very experimental in crisis, because in crisis you seek to survive. You are not playful, yeah? You're not saying, I try this out because I'm generous, yeah? This is, so, yeah, so I would be really interested in this different...
To add to this, because it refers to this experimental attitude.
Yeah.
I don't think that you are saying we are in a crisis. I would say we are talking about a crisis, and that's a difference.
Yeah, yes,
so
I think
we can still think about.
Yes,
and we can still think about experimental ways of.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Realities,
yes.
And just brief before I comment on, because I wanted to bring it back to the way of because I'm interested in the expert-non-expert relationship. Yeah? And you were quoting or referring to modeling, mathematical modeling or scientific modeling, and there's an interesting, without being now an adherent to, although I would like to protect her a bit from Harvard, but that's a different thing, to post-humanism, but deducing it in a different way. This is of course showing a problem, because you all know this kind of principle of the underdetermination of the theories by the facts. Yeah? That modeling has a gap between reality, and you choose parameters and variables, and this kind of, that the observations are not enough to narrow. So we have an abundance of models and theories, in contrast that we always believe we need theories. No, we have many theories, that we have enough of theories, and in a lab exists to narrow down theories, because it can analogically almost scale vary the variables. Yeah? And this has been formalized, this underdetermination principle by Henri. And then what he concludes from that is that it's very dangerous, and it cannot, to draw conclusions from my models. And I think this even normal people understand. And that makes the role of the experts, of course, a difficult one, if they are aware of this problem, that they are still, even now with global climate change. So you could assume that these models are very complex, although we know the observations and we have many, many hints that this is happening. The conclusion from that everything should put on the burden on the shoulders of the CO2 is still a part of the model and conclusion from that. And then the question, of course, starts to, again, if we then ask ourselves, how should we then relate? Is it then to make alarmism? Should we then now say, hey, yes, now the catastrophe is here, which by the way is a principle of this enlightened catastrophism by Jean-Pierre Dupuis, who says we should do as if we are already in the crisis. However, keep in mind that we are the unique cause for this disastrous fate that we are victims that we are now. So that we can change it, which is contradictory. If I already know what the future is, why should I change it? Because I'm anyway victim of the destiny. However, I keep it. But you could have the other trick that we are be careful with these kind of relationship to our future, because the conclusions from this gap between model and reality can end up in a totalitarianism again. Because we can say we have a CO2 totalitarianism in the end. This can be very. Therefore, I like an experimental attitude that narrows down the scope of solutions. And in this case, I would say yes, I'm fine by. And I think to again be the spokespersons for not the posthumanism in general, but Latour and others, I think. And more or less, Isabel Stenger's the way to have this kind of small scale. We were talking about the problem of scale yesterday. This small scale problem is exactly rooted there. Yeah? Because geoengineering and all sorts of deductions of this problem of gap between model and reality, Baird has this kind of problem that we are ending up again in a collateral effect or in a non-intentional consequence of something that is destroying our planet. And we have now 300 years of scientific insights and mobilizations, and we are part of this world. And I'm fine, and I'm going with you when I say AMT maybe misses out in their networks, are missing out the labor, the people, the discrepancies, as we were referring to John Law's work yesterday. But I would wonder, without now going to the post-humanists, by using rationality, using this undetermination principle from within an expert community, you have to be very careful about your own role as an expert in the society, I would say. And that makes it, but I'm in general, so I would not make too strong this post-humanist bashing, because it's okay, I'm fine by that, but I think that there are other reasons also coming from using their own reason, rationality, that maybe bring us to a narrative, vision, communication, you were calling it, to a narrative that allows us to become a more we feeling, as we are part of the system, we are part of the globe. Where do we have those narratives that allow us to develop this without having totalitarianism? Yeah? That's an interesting question there.
Yeah? You mentioned experiments, and you pointed out yesterday that people want you to go and find this case study to illustrate something. Now, there's a film made, it's an Austrian film, it's called A New We, and the director has gone around to something like 15 different eco-villages around Europe. Big ones like Tamahara, Damhur, and then smaller ones. And if you watch this, he's presenting these are different possibilities. But when I watched it, what struck me was these are individual experiments or case studies. Where is it, if it's a whole society, are we going to be able to make these case studies work on a societal level? Are they like the communes of the 60s that were great for the few people in them, lasted for 15, 20 years and then disappeared and didn't really make an impact? So I don't know if you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, that's how it operates. I remember watching a television program some years ago about photovoltaic power and how there were journalists who were visiting this village in some North African country, Algeria, I think it was, and there was a whole television program about how they were installing light bulbs and how happy the villagers were. They had finally had lighting, and they worked off and on, and they had to wait for a long time for an engineer to show up and fix them, and maybe it was supposed to be thought of as a success story, and we were supposed to be happy about what solar power did to Algerian villages. But my question was, okay, light bulbs are fine, but how much of the global energy system can be run, not only is run, but can be run on photovoltaic power? Can we run trains, tractors, heavy-duty machinery on solar power? And then I read the book by Prieto and Charles Hall on photovoltaics in Spain, where they showed that only about 0.3% of world energy came from photovoltaics.
When did you read this book?
The book was published 2013.
Okay.
And I know there's a great increase now, speaking of technological possibilities, but as I mentioned yesterday in one of the discussions, a lot of the lowering of prices of photovoltaics is related to having moved much of the production to low-wage countries in Eastern Asia. And for me, that is not a good way of arguing for photovoltaics, that now they can compete with fossil fuels because we're using less expensive labor. It just sort of is more of the same. It's an example of the same. But yeah, your point about not seeing the whole, finding case studies, this is a very big problem in anthropology, I think. You have to go and find your field site, like this Algerian village, for example. But to understand the global system and to understand that the world system has its ups and downs, it's had it historically. I remember when Ivan Illich visited Lund in the 70s, and I went there with my teacher in anthropology to listen to him. My teacher's name was Jonathan Friedman. He still lives in Lund. And I remember I liked what Ivan Illich was saying, you know, about we have to become more frugal, we have to downscale everything. And then my anthropological teacher, who was very much into world system analysis, he said, to me this sounds like an ideology of decline. So, and he was at that time at least very optimistic about civilization. Now he views world history very much in terms of ups and downs, and he has for a number of years been arguing that America will be going downhill soon, will decline and so on. But I think we really need to understand this global system that we're all a part of. We have to understand what part we play in it and how the logic of this global system can explain what's happening in the world. It can explain Trump, it can explain Brexit, it can explain all kinds of things. And it can explain our technology. And it can also explain global warming and the risk of collapse and economic crisis. And we have to ground our understanding of these processes at the global level. But of course, like the Dark Mountain Society, we have to think in terms of how can we, on a more restricted scale, survive the crisis ahead of us. I've been involved in do you know degrowth, the degrowth movement? Degrowth? Next year we're having the degrowth conference in Lund, actually. The last time I think it was in Leipzig, so on. I mean it's quite a big conference. Last time I think there were 4,000 or 5,000 people. So it's become, the degrowth idea has become a vision of a future beyond economic growth. And actually, the article that I referred to yesterday in Journal of Political Ecology is part of a special section in that journal devoted to degrowth. So my argument is that if we want to look at, if we want to have a society that does not emphasize economic growth, it needs to have a different currency. So that's how it's tied together. I mean, my model for a complementary currency should be connected to a general degrowth perspective. That's why economists wouldn't even look at it most of the time.
I have another question. Like yesterday you said, okay, there was a technology before the Industrial Revolution, and for me there is now like the development of the digital revolution, and but as you explained, you don't see this as another step of development of technology, which is like close to the change which happened with the Industrial Revolution, what it does, because as you said before, now this connection, okay, internet is now with all the complexity, but it's first time allowing a global community with people who have access to the internet, so it's also limited.
Yeah.
But isn't this digital revolution, for me, it's like
part of the
as
development.
big as the industrial.
Yeah.
You understand what?
Yeah. Well, this is one of those tricky questions again where I feel lost at the moment. But I'm working on it. But there's something about the internet. It apparently is not localized. You can't say that the internet is somewhere. You can say that there are people have access or not have access to the internet. But for example, the great thing in relation to my currency scheme is that money for thousands of years has been a commodity, a thing. When it was gold, when money was gold or silver, you could steal it. You could hoard it. You could keep it. You could bury it in the ground. You could store it. It was a physical thing. But if money becomes completely electronic, just science, just information, and if it's interest-free, then I think the very conditions of money fetishism would disappear.
Yeah. And just a side note to this like this notion which we hear often that the internet has no locality. I actually think within your terms that this is a part of fetishism of technology, because go to where the servers are, bomb them, and you won't have any internet any longer, you know. And most of the server landscapes are in the US or in other wealthy parts. You won't find them in Congo or in other poorer countries. So they have a locality, and I would say there's also fetishism behind this, to say it doesn't have a locality. Like, we need the servers and we need the power plants which
many of the servers are in Scandinavia because of the cheap hydro power electricity.
Well, you know that the Facebook servers in Sweden, they're up in northern Sweden in a place called Umeå, because it's good if it's somewhere cold, it's more efficient. But apparently the Facebook servers use more electricity than the local steel plant. So, of course, the internet is not dematerialized. You're absolutely right. And at this point, I can only say, okay, you got me there. I have no answer. I would love for us to have a planetary nervous system. It's like what Teilhard de Chardin called the noosphere, that combines humanity, that makes it possible for us to exchange ideas without any great cost of biophysical resources. But if this is the case, if you guys are all right, then I rest my case. I don't know what.
You might want to read Jeremy Rifkin. You probably know it.
Well, he read Georgescu Roegen, you see, and I've got Rifkin, but...
I mean, Rifkin is probably someone you don't like, and we perhaps all of us don't like, because he's very much into kind of apology of the current system. But he has written a book about the fourth industrial revolution, where he tries to explain that indeed there's something totally new now. This we cannot compare that what is happening with what happened before. So that is some guy who tries to and indeed there have been other technological revolutions before the Industrial Revolution, and one of them, interestingly enough, was in the Middle Ages. I don't know, that there's a book, the Industrial Revolution of the Middle Ages by a certain...
was it Landis?
No, it was Gampel, it's a French guy. Jean Gampel. And he explains that this now rediscovered Middle Ages built very much of their kind of well-being, which you mentioned, on new technologies being developed during that period. One of them was hydropower. According to him, hydropower,
yes,
for mills and for other applications was...
There are very different histories being written about the Middle Ages. Now, these French people who wrote in the Servitude of Power, De Beer, De Lirage, and so on, Emery, they argue that the first hydropower, the first water mills, were built as Rome was collapsing to replace the increasingly expensive slaves. Yeah, because slaves had become so expensive and so rare and they had built all of society on slaves. That was their basic energy source, basically ancient Rome. And it's interesting philosophically, I mean, in terms of the philosophy of technology, the first proto-machines, the first water mills were built to replace slaves. Because, pardon?
Jean Améry is
yes, exactly. This is his argument, yeah. And it gives us a perspective on what machines are. They are replacements for slaves historically. And actually slaves were understood by Romans and Greek as being sort of mindless machines in a sense. There was a lot of ideology about slaves not having minds in the same way that free people. So replacing slaves with machines is an interesting historical understanding of technology. But I have difficulties understanding technological development in the Middle Ages as being decoupled from global processes. And the so-called New World History, I would, for example, recommend a book by Kenneth Pomerantz called The Great Divergence. It was published in the year 2000, where he argues that Europe at the end of the 18th century, in the late 1700s, was basically no different from China or India at that time. The great divergence that Pomerantz calls it was what happened after the late 18th century. This was when basically the Industrial Revolution. This was what made Europe diverge from China and India. This was when Europe was able to use all the land of the New World that was conveniently available to it, and the fossil fuels that England was excavating. So fossil fuels and the empty land of the New World, empty because of the epidemics, of course. But this was what gave Europe a special position in relation to China and India. And it was also the reason why Europe was able to develop its technology. And André Gunder Frank, who I think it was you who mentioned yesterday, he has a wonderful sentence in Reorient, which was one of his, well, it was one of his latest books. Reorient, which is a pun, of course, reorient, back to the Orient. He says that there was no European technology. And he bases his argument on some of the work by Jim Blount, who wrote a book called 8 Eurocentric Historians and a Colonialist's View of the World, and so on and so on. But he challenged these historians of technology like Landis, David Landis, by arguing that it was not that Europe had been building up this momentum, this engineering momentum, that finally culminated in the Industrial Revolution. Instead, he argues, what happened was that most of the innovations that Europe made so much out of had been invented elsewhere. You were probably surprised to know that iron forging was highly developed in West Africa. And the printing press that we think of as a European invention was invented in Korea, and so on and so on. And of course, you know the gunpowder from China and so on. But it's very interesting to see that these technological innovations were really picked up from all over the world, brought into Europe, and made to serve the interests of capital. So it's not that Europeans were more ingenious than other people. It's just that they used all these inventions as a way to promote capital accumulation and the conquest of the world. So that's why I think that Pomerantz is right in saying that something decisive happened in the late 18th century, and we shouldn't be looking to European Middle Ages to find the roots of the Industrial Revolution. That's why I would argue against the classical view of capitalism as well as something that started in Europe in the 1500s. That's Immanuel Wallerstein's argument, and Jason Moore, actually.
I mean, it did start.
Pardon?
Okay, no, I just wanted to say we have now, I think, 20 minutes.
Yes, I'll shut up.
A lot of books. A lot of books. So I wanted to ask now, how should we proceed to use those 20 minutes? There is the option to continue discussion. Please, if you have urgent question, tell me now. If not, we can ask Lilian. He has some way to, because maybe it would make sense, yeah, to listen to you, what you were thinking about when you were reading Alf and referring it to your yes, connecting it to reading texts coming from the arts. Maybe you can go for this so that we listen to another voice. Yeah.
The problem with listening to this voice, I think our time is too limited. Like, my idea was an artist which many of you know, I guess, is Peter Steil, a German-Japanese artist. Peter Steil, very big artist at the moment. She did the German pavilion of the Venice Biennale, the last one. So that kind
I just have problems to hear you.
Sorry.
Maybe it's too fast or not.
The acoustics are bad.
You have to come closer.
Come closer, or
no, speak up. Slower
I will talk very slowly, but I'm actually really afraid that I cannot make this point sufficiently. But Hitter Steyer, she is mainly a video artist who is also writing a lot of very good, pointed essays. And she develops a very interesting position, and I had to think about it when you said when humans are objectified, that's a violation to them. And she's actually saying we should start to love being objectified and find the emancipatory potential in being an object. Because she's saying like our entire Enlightenment tradition of emancipation is becoming subject. The women want to become subject, the slaves want to become subjects. Now the things want to become subjects. And she's very Marxist actually, and she's saying we should love our alienation, we should sort of start to deal with it.
What do the feminists say?
She's a feminist.
Yes, I she wants people to become objects. Well, I'm sorry.
Yes, but this is what I would like to bring in, but the problem is it's a 10-page article which we won't be able to read here, and there's not a video I could think of right now which would present this well enough, so I think I have to stop here and have this, like, maybe it's just an idea we can take home with us and read for ourselves, because I would find it a very interesting sort of dissonance to you, because that's also a position which somebody says, and
Yes, I have to support this view, the problem of bringing me back again to my question, of course, what notion do you have about the human in the name of the department, human ecology? And if you listen then to the humanness, how you frame the humanness, and I have to protect that, I don't know how you have not read too much about I'm not very familiar with her work, but I understood so much that I would say that it's a strategic move how she relates to other beings, entities that are not human, and also her relationship, and I like it very much, her experimental. Everyone was mocking her concerning her relationship with her dog, but how she's experimentally doing ability sport, experimentally relating and investigating a relationship to make her think philosophically on this experiment, it's quite interesting. Yeah, this is a very nice problem. And how she then refers to this hybridization of genes, and you know it maybe better than me. And I think this is a strategic way. It's quite similar, I think, to Dieter Steyer, when to say we are not the crown of the whatever. So please, we have humanism now since how many centuries, and what happened? I mean, we could say this is a fatalistic being. Maybe yes, we're getting extinct then, but that's maybe good for our planet. However, so that's maybe something that is connected to that. And this is making, and humanness and human being also connects to the question of, and you are trying to define in your book as well and in the article how you would exchange human and non-humans with living and non-living, and then we define the living and what is connected to that. That's fine. But however, this is, I would say, this is not, and you get into the danger of being again essentialistic again, yeah, to being again trying to give definitions, referring for instance in animals, we invited plenty of people working with animals, and if you look at the work of Nancy Desprey, investigating these human-animal relationships and how it shapes the way the scientific method shapes their findings, how we think they are. And you were talking about purpose and intentionality, and maybe you would go to a very famous zoologist in Austria working with crows and ravens. He would say, "Come on, you make the limit
as
borders. You conceptualize. Sorry, I'm finishing here. You try to construct a humanness by delimiting it from something else, but these borders are constantly moving and are dynamic. Yeah, and I don't want to criticize your position, but
I have a problem with this multi-species entanglement argument that you see with Haraway and Anat Singh, not least because I have a past as a farmer, and I know what it is to be entangled in other species. I had 200 sheep, and I had cows, and I had geese and cats, and I took care of my vegetables and my trees. Donna Haraway has one dog. And that's what she built her multi-species entanglement on. And I don't know if you have to be a zoologist to understand what it means to relate to other species. I think you can be a farmer, actually. Okay, so I have problems with that, but I do think that there is a big difference between humans and non-humans, and also between living and non-living things. And let me give you an example. Bruno Latour, he got the Hornborg Prize. I don't know if you're aware of that, but on his own website, he calls it the Nobel Prize of the Humanities. This is Latour's own words. So he was very proud. But for me, there's a big, big contradiction between the fact that he got this huge prize in the humanities. And then if you read his lecture, the Hornborg lecture, it's called Agency in the Anthropocene by Bruno Latour. It's his thank you speech when he gets this huge prize. And I must say that it's the most anti-humanities lecture I've ever heard, because what he argues in that lecture is that General Kutuzov in Tolstoy's War and Peace has about as much agency as the Mississippi River when the Katrina storm, you know, made New Orleans submerged underwater. And if you want to put the agency of a river on a par with the agency of an army general, then I don't think you're talking to humanists. At least not humanists the way I think of humanities. Because for me, the word responsibility and accountability is still part of being human. And I don't think you can say to the Mississippi River, you did something wrong here. You should have taken your responsibility and not inundated New Orleans. But you should be able to say that to General Kutuzov and any other army general, because they are responsible for their actions. Now, if Bruno Latour wants to put them on a par and say that nobody's really accountable, it means nobody has responsibility either. And for me, that's very congruent with his own argument on agency and actors and so on, because his own work does not take responsibility.
I draw different conclusions from that.
Okay, so I'm wondering what kind of humanities are we talking about? And when you ask what I mean by human, I do mean that contrary not only to rocks and rivers and planets, but also to all other animals, including dogs, we have a choice. We have a responsibility. We can decide whether to do this or do that, whether to have a capitalist world system or not. Now, if we didn't have that choice, what would be the point of deliberating about the Anthropocene? We could just sit down and wait for it. We do have a choice, and we have a responsibility and an accountability that rivers don't and rocks don't.
Coming in a minute, just to reply to this, I was talking to Marco an hour ago. I was investigating this problem of humanity, and I tried to keep it short. In my own fieldwork, when I was investigating a special case in the healthcare system. And there, if you have a controversy in the healthcare system or in a clinical setting, where nurses, medical doctors, therapists, patients, and whatever quarrel with each other because of any issue, then they look at each other and say, but in the end of the day, what counts is the human being. So, right, we all agree. And if you look closely in daily practice, it's a very empty phrase. You don't know what this humanness means in this. I was investigating legally incompetent persons that are in a long-term coma. Yeah. How does decision-making between people then goes if you are not responsible for your actions? That's where your kind of signature, so famous informed consent. And if you investigate it very closely, humanness and the entanglement between and what the person is and what the body is, you would not assume how malleable we are and how entangled we are already in this system with technology and artifacts. And my conclusion of reading Latour or John Locke and the moment is completely different, to say, yes, I understood that we can do political, ontological politics there. For instance, in concrete cases, small scale, it's not a silver bullet thing, to think about the problem of what is a person by introducing, as we did, different technological artifacts that compare to all these huge machines called MRT or whatever. interesting experiments. That is my conclusion I draw from it. An experimental attitude toward things, also with artistic methods and other methods, like, that would be my question, like what you use, other use. So I don't throw overboard analysis, rationality, reason. No, not at all. But you are not inscribing yourself in a pre-given, non-expert-expert relationship where you say, they say, the scientists, experts say this is like this, I take it for granted and work with it. No, we all have problems. We have not only methods, we have problems, issues. We're talking a lot about issues, controversies, interests that we have, passions, yeah? And then we sit together, and you are from this side, you are from there, and then try to, but on a political plane, yeah? Where this is an important question. A narrative we need, then we were talking about it, where to start. And that, I think, so the argument of this humanist, and I know you come from Scandinavia, maybe also we're talking about the question of autonomy of the person, is much more stronger than in another country where you think I'm a moral collective. Yeah? Socialist countries, some people coming from former socialist countries, looking back, no, but where maybe the person itself is conceptualized a bit different. Maybe I'm not telling you anything new about that. Yeah? But ethics in the clinical setting, looking at you because you were kind of an ethicist for me, in a clinic did not help much. Yeah? And therefore the applied ANT for me, yeah, was quite useful. Still, I'm trying to have my own perspective on that and not trying to mimic all these things. So that was my theory.
And you mentioned legal accountability. I think law is extremely important here. I mean, at what point are we accountable for our actions? At what point are we legally accountable? And I remember this hilarious story. In the Middle Ages, apparently, you could bring insects to court. You know this story? That there were insects who would eat up the crop, like grasshoppers or something, or bugs or something, yeah. And they brought them to court. They had a lawyer who said, well, I defend them, you know, and the others challenged them. And finally, I think they were freed, actually, in the court. But anyway, so obviously the idea of accountability legally before the law, there's been a lot of humans or multi-species entanglements, so to speak. If insects many hundreds of years ago were considered legally responsible for their actions. But it's an interesting issue. Are human beings accountable at all? Is there such a thing as free will? Was Sartre completely wrong? Or do we have some kind of responsibility for what we say and what we do and for the choices we make?
I think these questions we have to leave all. We have one last.
In the question of like responsibility and accountability, so the technology, not as this whole globalized system, but it's like a single object, a gun. Would you say it's neutral then? Like if you say
No. I would say no. Technology. Exactly my point yesterday. And the technology is never neutral. There's no such thing as technology as such. It's always implied by a socio-technical system. But you think perhaps not more in terms of the gun, what it could be used for.
Yes. Yeah. Like if you mentioned like the free will and so on.
I think that's more like what Langdon Winner would say about technology, that if you make a nuclear bomb, you know, then you obviously have an intention to have it used somewhere, or at least to scare people. So in that sense, technology is not neutral. But I would argue there's another sense in which it is not neutral, and that is that in order to have these machines, you have to have unequal exchange also. So there are two ways. Yeah.
So I think Alf is running to the taxi.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good moment to stop now. I thank you very much, Alf, to come here to Vienna. First of all,
thank you. It's been wonderful.
It was a great for me. I hope also for you it was a pleasure to listen to your ideas and solutions, proposals. And of course, thank you for hosting us here in Riga, giving us the possibility to be here. And then, finally, thank you for coming and taking part in this workshop.
Thank you all. Great discussion.
So now I shut up. Okay, have a nice day.